They say a king is only as strong as the fear he commands. But what happens when the man who rebuilt an empire from ashes discovers the very throne he bled for was built on the bones of innocence? When the alpha, who conquered enemies on every border, finds out his greatest betrayal came from within his own palace walls? King Raelthorn Dreyke thought he knew what power cost. He was wrong, dead wrong. And the woman who would show him the truth? She was nobody. A washerwoman, the world had already decided, didn't matter. Stick around until the end of this story, because what happens next will shake everything you thought you knew about strength, survival, and the price of looking away when it's easier to stay blind. Drop a like and comment your city name below so I know my pack is riding with me on this one. The smell hit Raelthorn first. Not the perfumed oils the servants burned in the throne room braziers, not the polished marble or the incense meant to mask the stench of politicking nobles who smiled with their mouths and plotted with their eyes. No, this was different. Copper, sweat, fear. He sat alone on the throne carved from black stone, the weight of the crown pressing against his temples like an old wound that never quite healed. 8 years he'd worn this thing. 8 years since he'd walked through fire and blood to unite the fractured territories under one banner. The nobles called him the Iron Alpha. The people called him Salvation. Neither title meant a damn thing when he couldn't sleep. Raelthorn's fingers drummed against the armrest, a habit he'd developed somewhere between the third assassination attempt and the fifth treaty negotiation that nearly collapsed into civil war. The throne room stretched out before him, vast and empty and cold despite the summer heat baking the capital outside. Sunlight cut through the stained glass windows above, painting the floor in reds and golds that looked too much like blood and fire. Victories of dead kings, the ceiling mural proclaimed. Battles won. Enemies slaughtered. Empires forged. He used to find comfort in that. Used to stare up at those painted warriors and feel like he belonged among them. Now he just saw ghosts. The door at the far end creaked open. Chancellor Malrek Voren glided in like oil spreading across water, his robes pristine, his smile calibrated to express exactly the right amount of deference without a hint of submission. The man was a masterpiece of political survival. Smooth, educated, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with claws or fangs. Raelthorn didn't move, didn't acknowledge him beyond a slight narrowing of his eyes. Malrek bowed. Not too deep? Never too deep. That would have been an insult in its own way, suggesting the king needed excessive shows of respect to feel secure. Your Majesty, the capital districts report full compliance with the new labor regulations. The harvest yields exceed projections by 12%. Trade caravans from the eastern territories arrived without incident. Raelthorn let the silence stretch, let it grow teeth. And the Omega district? Malrek's expression didn't change, didn't even flicker. That was the first tell. Stable, Your Majesty. Crime rates continue their decline. The magistrates report no significant disturbances. Raelthorn stood. The movement was deliberate, controlled, the kind of motion that made lesser wolves take a step back without realizing they'd done it. He descended the 3 steps from the throne platform, boots echoing against stone. No significant disturbances, he repeated, voice flat as winter ice. That's your assessment? Malrek inclined his head. The numbers support it, Your Majesty. Numbers? Raelthorn almost laughed. Almost. He moved past the Chancellor, hands clasped behind his back, every inch the warrior king these halls expected him to be. But inside, in the parts of himself he kept locked down tighter than the royal vaults, something churned. 3 weeks ago, the reports started arriving. Anonymous. Unsigned. Delivered to his private chambers in the dead of night by sources he couldn't trace. At first, he'd dismissed them. Every ruler accumulated enemies. Fabricated scandals were standard political ammunition. He'd weathered worse. But these reports carried details. Names, addresses, dates, the kind of specificity that didn't come from imagination. Omega families disappearing from the outer districts. Children sold into debt labor to satisfy fabricated violations. Women branded with ownership marks beneath laws that shouldn't exist but somehow did anyway. Buried in legal codes he'd never personally reviewed because kings didn't have time to read every statute passed by every magistrate in every territory. That was what chancellors were for. Tell me about the Vera family, Raelthorn said quietly. Behind him, Malrek went still. It lasted maybe half a second, maybe less. But Raelthorn had spent years reading the micro-expressions of men who smiled while planning murders. He caught it. "I'm not familiar with that name, Your Majesty." Raelthorn turned, looked the Chancellor dead in his carefully neutral face. "Selene Vera, washerwoman, Outer District, 4th Sector. She has a younger brother, Lucian, born without the ability to shift. Their parents died 6 years ago during rogue attacks near the western border. The silence in the throne room had weight now. Pressure. The kind that made ears pop. Malrek's smile never wavered. "I'm certain the magistrate records would have more detailed information if Your Majesty requires it." "I'm certain they would," Raelthorn agreed. His wolf prowled beneath his skin, agitated, sensing the lie the way predators sensed wounded prey trying to hide blood. "Dismissed, Chancellor." Malrek bowed again, turned, walked toward the doors with that same unhurried grace that set Raelthorn's teeth on edge. The doors closed. Raelthorn stood alone again, and for the first time in 8 years, the king who'd conquered 12 territories and unified a broken empire under one iron-fisted rule felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the day he'd taken the throne. Doubt. Not in his strength, not in his ability to kill anything that threatened him. Doubt that he actually knew what the hell was happening in his own kingdom. Bug. Midnight found Raelthorn in the armory, stripping off the ceremonial armor and replacing it with clothes that looked like they'd been pulled from a corpse. Torn shirt, threadbare trousers, boots held together with wire in desperation. He stared at himself in the polished shield hanging on the wall. The face looking back barely resembled the king. Dirt rubbed into his skin, hair deliberately matted, the kind of transformation that required more than costume. It required becoming someone else, becoming nothing, Your Majesty. Raelthorn didn't flinch. Captain Torvald stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression carved from the same granite as the palace walls. The man had been his first lieutenant during the Unification Wars, had taken a blade meant for Raelthorn's spine during the siege of House Malther, earned the right to speak freely through blood and loyalty. "You're really doing this," Torvald said. "Not a question." "I am. The council will lose their minds if they find out." "Then they won't find out." Raelthorn pulled the ragged cloak around his shoulders. It smelled like mildew and smoke. "Perfect. I'll be back before dawn." "And if you're not?" Raelthorn met his captain's gaze. "Then you burn the reports, all of them. Tell the court I died hunting in the northern range. Make it convincing." Torvald's jaw worked. "You really think it's that bad out there?" Raelthorn didn't answer immediately. He moved to the narrow window, staring out at the capital sprawling below. Lights flickered in the wealthy districts, steady and bright. The outer sectors sat in darkness. "I think," Raelthorn said slowly, "that sitting on a throne makes you blind faster than any wound ever could. I think comfort is a poison that kills kings slower than swords, but just as dead. I think I've spent 8 years rebuilding an empire while trusting other men to tell me the truth about what was happening in the streets." He turned back to face Torvald. "I think I've been a fool." The captain said nothing. What could he say? Kings didn't admit mistakes. Kings didn't question their own foundations. But Raelthorn stopped being just a king the moment he read the first report. The moment he saw Selene Vera's name written in desperate handwriting across parchment stained with what might have been tears. A washerwoman. An Omega the world had decided didn't matter. And if the reports were true, a woman working herself to death to keep her brother alive while the empire Raelthorn built consumed the weak beneath polished marble and pretty speeches about unity and strength. He left through the servants' passage, descended into tunnels that smelled like rats and centuries-old stone, emerged in an alley 3 streets from the palace walls, where the cobblestones turned to packed dirt and the air tasted like desperation. The outer district at night was a different world. Raelthorn walked through it like a ghost, kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, the posture of someone who'd learned to make themselves small to avoid notice. Wolves were creatures of hierarchy and dominance, but the broken ones, the ones the empire chewed up and spat out, they learned to move differently. They learned to disappear. He watched a patrol of guards stop an Omega woman near the market square, watched them demand her identification papers, watched her hands shake as she produced them, watched the lead guard tear them in half and laugh. "Now you're in violation of imperial law. That's a 50 silver fine or 3 months labor service. Please, the woman whispered. I have children. I just forgot to renew the... The guard backhanded her. She hit the ground hard. Nobody helped her. The other Omegas in the square looked away, kept walking. Survival meant not drawing attention, meant not being the next one bleeding in the dirt while uniformed wolves decided how much your life was worth. Raelthorn's hands clenched into fists inside his cloak. His wolf snarled beneath his skin, demanding violence, demanding he rip these bastards apart for daring to... He forced it down, forced himself to keep walking, to stay invisible, because kings who revealed themselves too early learned nothing except how quickly people could fabricate lies when power was watching. 3 hours later, he found the stables, royal horses on one side, working animals on the other, the smell of hay and manure and honest labor. A single lantern burned near the back entrance, casting long shadows across the dirt floor. And there, kneeling beside a water trough, was a woman scrubbing clothes with hands that looked like they'd been worked raw. Raelthorn had seen her face in the reports, sketched descriptions, second-hand accounts. But seeing her in person was different. Selene Vera was small, thin in the way that came from missing too many meals. Her hair hung in a dark braid down her back, a few strands escaping to frame a face that would have been beautiful if exhaustion hadn't carved itself into every line. She wore the rough wool dress of servant class. No shoes, feet calloused and scarred. She looked up as he approached, and Raelthorn saw her eyes. Gray, like storm clouds before lightning, the kind of eyes that shouldn't belong to a washerwoman, the kind of eyes that saw too much and understood more than they should. He stumbled deliberately, went down on one knee beside the stable wall, gasped like a man on the edge of collapse, because that's what starving vagabonds did, and that's who he needed to be. Selene dropped the clothes immediately, moved toward him without hesitation. Hey, you're hurt. Her voice was softer than he expected, hoarse, like she'd screamed herself raw once and never quite recovered. Raelthorn shook his head weakly. Just hungry. Haven't eaten in days. She knelt beside him. Her scent hit him then. Beneath the soap and sweat and stable smell, there was something else, something that made his wolf go absolutely still. Mate. No. Not possible. Not now. Not her. Selene reached for the small cloth bag tied at her waist, pulled out half a loaf of bread. It looked old, stale. Probably the only food she had. She broke it in half, gave him the larger piece. Here, she said quietly. It's not much, but it'll help. Raelthorn stared at the bread in his hand, at this woman who had every reason to ignore a stranger dying in the dirt, who had nothing to spare and gave anyway. Why? The word came out rougher than intended. Selene smiled. It was tired, sad. The smile of someone who'd seen too much darkness and decided kindness was the only rebellion left. Because I know what it's like to be hungry, she said simply, and I know what it's like when nobody gives a damn. She stood, grabbed a tin cup, filled it with water from the trough, and handed it to him. Drink slow. You'll make yourself sick otherwise. Raelthorn drank. The water tasted like rust and mercy. He watched her over the rim of the cup, watched the way she moved back to her washing like feeding strangers was something she did every night, like compassion was reflexive instead of calculated. His wolf recognized her long before his mind caught up, not just as a mate, as something more dangerous, as balance. What's your name? Selene asked, scrubbing at a stain that probably wouldn't come out. Rael, he lied. Just Rael. I'm Selene. She glanced back at him. You have somewhere to sleep tonight, Rael? No. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded toward the far corner of the stable where old hay was piled high. You can stay there. Guards don't check this area until dawn. Just be gone before first light. Why are you helping me? She paused, hands going still in the wash water. When she spoke again, her voice carried something brittle beneath the surface. Because someone should, she said. Because this empire eats people alive and calls it order. Because I'm tired of watching folks die in the street while nobles toast their victories in the palace. She turned to face him fully. And because maybe, just maybe, if I help you tonight, someone will help my brother when I'm not there to protect him anymore. The fear in her eyes was real, raw, the kind of fear that came from experience instead of imagination. Raelthorn felt something crack open inside his chest. He'd spent 8 years building an empire, and this woman was terrified she couldn't keep her brother alive in it. That night, Raelthorn lay in the hay while Selene finished her washing, watched her work until her hands shook with exhaustion, watched her finally curl up in a corner with a threadbare blanket, asleep within seconds. And the king of the 7 territories realized something terrible. He'd been blind. Not for days, not for weeks, for years. And the woman who'd just shown him the truth with a piece of stale bread and a cup of rusty water was about to change absolutely everything. 3 nights later, Raelthorn knew the outer district better than his own throne room. He'd watched guards extort omegas for fabricated violations, watched debt collectors seize children from their parents' arms, watched magistrates sentence women to forced labor for crimes that existed only on parchment signed by officials who profited from each new slave. And through it all, Selene moved like a ghost, trying to stay invisible. She worked 3 jobs: washing clothes at the stables, cleaning tavern floors after midnight, mending torn fabric for pennies in the pre-dawn hours. Raelthorn followed her through the routine, watched her count copper coins with the desperate focus of someone calculating survival day by day. He learned about Lucian, too, her brother. 15 years old, born without the ability to shift, which meant society labeled him defective, broken, useless, the kind of wolf the Empire had no place for beyond grunt labor or worse. Selene visited him every evening in the cramped room they shared above a butcher's shop, brought him food she didn't eat herself, checked the bruises on his arms from whatever work the foreman had assigned him that day, helped him with reading lessons using stolen books because education for non-shifters wasn't funded by imperial law. Raelthorn watched through a crack in the wall, watched her break down crying after Lucian fell asleep, exhaustion and fear finally overwhelming her in the darkness. Watched her wipe her eyes and stand back up, because that's what survival looked like when giving up meant your brother died. And every night, Raelthorn returned to the stables where she'd first found him. Every night, they talked. She thought he was just another broken wolf the Empire had chewed up, another casualty of a system built to crush anyone who wasn't strong enough to fight back. She told him about her parents, about the rogue attack 6 years ago that left her and Lucian orphaned, about the debt collectors who showed up 3 days after the funeral, claiming her parents owed money on fabricated loans. "The Empire doesn't care if you're innocent," she said one night, voice hollow. "It just cares if you're useful, and the moment you're not, you disappear." Raelthorn sat beside her in the hay, close enough to feel her warmth. "What would you do? If you had power, real power, what would you change?" Selene laughed bitterly. "Everything. I'd burn the whole damn system down and start over. Even if it meant war?" She looked at him then. Really looked. Her gray eyes cut through him like she could see past the dirt and rags to whatever truth he was hiding. "There's already a war," she said quietly. "It's just one-sided. The powerful kill the weak every day and call it civilization. So yeah, if burning it down meant my brother could live without fear, I'd light the match myself." Raelthorn felt his wolf surge inside him, not with aggression, with recognition. This woman, this Omega the world had decided didn't matter. She had the heart of a warrior, the instincts of a ruler, the kind of strength tyrants feared most because it didn't come from violence. It came from refusing to break. "You're dangerous," he said before he could stop himself. Selene smiled sadly. "I'm a washerwoman. I'm the opposite of dangerous." "No. You understand people. You see through lies before the words finish forming. Animals trust you. Wolves listen when you speak, even when they pretend not to." She tilted her head, studying him. "You talk like someone educated, like someone who's been around power." Raelthorn's pulse kicked up. "Maybe I was. Once. What happened? I learned that power doesn't protect you from becoming a monster. It just gives you better excuses." The silence between them felt heavy, weighted with things neither of them could say. Then Selene did something that broke Raelthorn completely. She reached out, took his hand. Her fingers were rough from work, scarred from years of labor, but her grip was steady. "You're not a monster, Rael. Whatever you did before, whatever brought you here, you're not that. How do you know? Said, because monsters don't share bread with strangers. They don't look guilty when they see suffering. You've got ghosts, yeah, but you're not dead inside yet. Raelthorn stared at their joined hands, at this woman who'd given him water and bread and shelter without knowing who he was, without caring about status or power or anything except basic human decency in a world that had forgotten what that meant. His wolf howled inside him. Mine, not as property, not as possession, as equal, as balance, as the one thing he'd spent 8 years missing without knowing the shape of the wound. What if I told you, Raelthorn said carefully, that the king doesn't know what's happening in his own empire, that the man on the throne thinks he rebuilt something good while corruption rotted everything from the inside? Selene's grip tightened. Then I'd say the king is a fool, or a coward, or both. Which do you think? She met his eyes. I think powerful men become dangerous when they finally see the truth, because either they fix it and lose everything they built, or they look away and prove they never deserved the throne in the first place. And if he tried to fix it? Selene's smile turned sharp. Then he better be ready for war, because the men profiting from suffering won't surrender without blood. Raelthorn felt something shift inside him, something fundamental, the kind of decision that changed kingdoms. He'd spent 8 years being the Iron Alpha, the conqueror, the warrior king who united territories through strength and fear. But sitting beside Selene in the hay-scented darkness, her hand warm in his, Raelthorn realized something terrifying. He'd found someone worth destroying his own empire for. And men who sit on thrones become monsters when they discover something they can't afford to lose. Bulk. The 5th night, everything shattered. Raelthorn arrived at the stables to find Selene backed against the wall by 3 guards in imperial uniforms. The lead one held a scroll. Official seal. Legal authority. By order of Chancellor Malrek Voren, you are charged with theft of royal property. The guard's voice carried the bored tone of someone who'd delivered this speech 1,000 times. 50 silver fine or 6 months labor service. Selene's face went white. I didn't steal anything. You fed a vagabond with food purchased using wages from royal employment. That food was property of the crown. It was my food. I bought it with my own... The guard backhanded her. She hit the ground hard. And Raelthorn's vision went red. His wolf erupted inside him, centuries of bloodline dominance screaming for violence. He took 1 step forward, power flooding through his body, about to tear these bastards apart with his bare hands. Selene looked at him from the ground. Her eyes found his through the darkness, and something in her expression stopped him cold. Fear. Not of the guards, of what would happen if he revealed himself. Because attacking Imperial guards meant execution, and she thought he was just a vagabond who'd die trying to defend her. Raelthorn forced himself to stay down, to stay weak, to watch while they dragged her to her feet. Your debt is now doubled for resisting an officer. 100 silver or 12 months service. Report to the labor camps by dawn tomorrow or face arrest. The guards left. Selene collapsed against the stable wall, shaking. Raelthorn moved to her immediately, rage and helplessness warring inside him. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. They saw me give you food, and I should have been more careful, and now... Don't, Raelthorn cut her off. This isn't your fault. She laughed bitterly. Everything's my fault. I couldn't save my parents, can't protect Lucian, can't even feed a stranger without the Empire punishing me for it. I'm tired, Rael. I'm so goddamn tired of surviving. Her voice cracked on the last word. And Raelthorn watched the strongest woman he'd ever met break down in the darkness, while the empire he'd built crushed her beneath laws signed by men he'd trusted. Selene. His voice came out rougher than intended. Look at me. She did. Tears streaming down her face. Defeat written in every line of her body. This empire you hate so much. If someone burned it down tomorrow, if someone with real power decided to tear the whole system apart and rebuild it properly, would you help? She stared at him like he'd lost his mind. What kind of question is that? A serious one. Selene wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. If someone had that kind of power and actually gave a damn about people like me, yeah, I'd help. I'd probably die helping, but at least it'd mean something. Raelthorn nodded slowly. Then trust me one more time. What? He stood, pulled her to her feet. His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing away tears. Tomorrow, everything changes. I swear it. But tonight, I need you to trust that I'm not who you think I am. Confusion flickered across her expression. What are you? Raelthorn kissed her. Not gently, not carefully. Like a man who'd been holding back his entire life and finally broke. Selene froze for half a second. Then her hands fisted in his torn shirt and she kissed him back like drowning, and he was air. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she stared at him with wide eyes. Who are you really? She whispered. Raelthorn smiled. It felt like the first real expression he'd worn in years. Someone who just remembered why kings exist in the first place. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed outside the stable. Heavy boots, multiple guards. Raelthorn's enhanced hearing caught the conversation. Orders from the Chancellor. She's a flight risk. Apprehend now. They were coming for her. Tonight. Not dawn. Malric was moving faster than expected. Raelthorn's mind raced. He could fight them, could kill every guard between here and the palace, but that would expose him too early before he'd gathered enough proof to… Selene gripped his arm. You need to run. If they find you here, they'll… I'm not leaving you. You have to. Please, Rael, just go. The stable door crashed open. 6 guards flooded in, led by a sergeant with cruel eyes and a smile that promised pain. Selene Vera, you're under arrest for conspiracy against the crown. That's insane. Selene's voice shook, but she stood her ground. I haven't conspired against anything. The sergeant's smile widened. That's for the magistrate to decide. Take her. 2 guards grabbed her arms, and Raelthorn realized he'd reached the edge, the point where pretending didn't matter anymore, where strategy gave way to instinct, where the king stopped planning and the wolf took over. He stepped forward, power flooding his body like liquid fire. His alpha aura exploded outward, raw and uncontrolled, hitting the guards like a physical wall. They went down hard, gasping, choking, instinct forcing them to their knees before dominance that made their wolves whimper in terror. Only the sergeant stayed standing, but barely. His face had gone gray, his hands shook. Who? His voice came out strangled. Who are you? Raelthorn let the glamour drop. Let them see past the dirt and rags to the man beneath. Let them see their king. The sergeant's eyes went wide as dinner plates. Recognition. Horror. Your Majesty! Raelthorn's voice came out cold enough to frost stone. Release her! Now! The guards dropped Selene immediately, scrambled backward, terror written across every face. Behind him, Raelthorn heard Selene's sharp inhale, felt her shock like a physical blow. He didn't turn around. Couldn't bear to see the betrayal he knew would be there. Tell Chancellor Vorin, Raelthorn said quietly, that I'll see him at dawn. In the throne room. And he better have a very good explanation for what I've witnessed in my own kingdom. The guards fled. Raelthorn stood alone in the sudden silence. Then, slowly, he turned. Selene backed away from him. 1 step. Then another. Her face had gone pale. Her hands shook. You're… She couldn't finish the sentence. The king, Raelthorn finished for her. His voice came out hollow. Yeah. The hurt in her eyes was worse than any wound he'd taken in war. You lied to me. Yes, everything, all of it. I needed to see the truth. Raelthorn took a step toward her. She flinched back. He stopped. And the truth was worse than I imagined. Selene, everything you told me about the Empire, about the corruption, about… Don't. Her voice cracked. Don't you dare make this about justice. You used me. I protected you. By lying? She laughed bitterly. You're just like every other powerful bastard who thinks compassion is weakness and honesty is optional. I'm trying to fix this by spying on your own people, by pretending to be something you're not. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face again. I trusted you. I told you things I've never told anyone. I let you… I know, and I'm sorry. Raelthorn's hands clenched into fists, but everything I learned, everything I saw, it's going to change. Tomorrow. I swear it. Selene stared at him, the woman who'd given him bread and water and shelter, who'd shown him compassion when she had nothing to spare, who'd kissed him like he mattered. "I don't believe you," she whispered. "Then watch." Raelthorn's voice went hard. "Tomorrow morning, in front of the entire court, I'm going to tear Malrek's empire apart. I'm going to expose every crime, every debt scheme, every fabricated law. And then I'm going to rebuild this kingdom the way it should have been from the start. And what about me? What happens to the washerwoman who was stupid enough to trust a king?" Raelthorn met her eyes. "You become my queen." The silence stretched between them. Heavy. Impossible. Selene's laugh was broken glass and ashes. "You don't get it, do you? Queens aren't chosen from the dirt. They're born in palaces and raised for crowns. I'm nobody, Rael, or your majesty, or whoever the hell you really are." She turned toward the stable doors. Raelthorn moved without thinking, closed the distance, spun her around. "You're wrong," he said fiercely. "You're the only person in this entire empire who saw me as human instead of a crown. You're the only one brave enough to speak truth to power when you thought I was powerless. You have instincts I've seen in battlefield generals and rulers who changed history." He pulled her closer. "And whether you believe it or not, my wolf recognized you the moment you gave me that bread. You're mine, Selene, not as property, as equal, as balance, as the one thing I didn't know I was missing." Her hands pressed against his chest, not pushing away, just present. "Your wolf is an idiot," she whispered. "Probably. But he's right about you." Selene looked up at him, storm cloud eyes swimming with tears and fury, and something else, something fragile and dangerous. "If you're lying again, I'm not. If you use me, never. If you break my trust again." "I won't survive it," Raelthorn finished, "because you're the only real thing I've found in 8 years of sitting on that throne, and I'll burn the whole empire down before I lose you." He kissed her again. And this time, when she kissed him back, it tasted like war and hope and the beginning of revolutions. When they finally broke apart, Selene rested her forehead against his chest. "Tomorrow's going to be hell," she murmured. Raelthorn smiled grimly. "Worse, tomorrow's going to be war." Outside the stable, the capital slept beneath stars and lies. Tomorrow, the deception would end. Tomorrow, the king would step out of the shadows. Tomorrow, an empire built on fear and silence and exploitation would face judgment. But tonight, in the darkness scented with hay and mercy, an Alpha and an Omega stood together. And somewhere in the palace, Chancellor Malrek Vorin made the mistake that would cost him everything. He decided Selene Vera needed to disappear before dawn. Dawn came to the capital like a knife slicing through silk. Raelthorn stood in his private chambers, stripped of the beggar's rags, wearing the full ceremonial armor of House Dreyke for the first time in weeks. Black steel etched with silver wolves. The crown of unity resting on the table beside him, waiting. He stared at his reflection in the polished mirror and barely recognized the man looking back. 8 years ago, he'd put on this armor to conquer enemies. Today, he'd wear it to judge the men who were supposed to be allies. Captain Torvald entered without knocking. His expression was granite and fury. "The council's assembling. They know something's wrong. Malrek's been in the throne room since before sunrise, whispering to every noble who'll listen. Let him whisper." Raelthorn buckled the last piece of armor into place. By noon, the only thing coming out of his mouth will be confessions or blood. "And the woman?" "Selene's with the royal guard. Safe." Raelthorn's jaw tightened. "She didn't want protection. Fought me on it until I made it a direct order." "Can't imagine why she wouldn't trust your judgment," Torvald said dryly. Raelthorn shot him a look. "Not the time." "When is the time, exactly?" "When you've started a civil war over an Omega washerwoman. When half the noble houses revolt because their king went soft over a pretty face." Raelthorn crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, got in Torvald's face with the kind of proximity that made lesser wolves back down immediately. "Watch. Your tone." Torvald didn't flinch, didn't move, just met his king's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd earned the right to speak truth, regardless of consequences. "You want me to watch my tone? Fine. Here's the truth without polish. You disappeared for a week. Came back claiming corruption that goes all the way to your most trusted advisor. Now you're about to drag the entire imperial court through a public trial based on evidence gathered while you were pretending to be a vagrant." His voice dropped lower. You better be absolutely certain about this, Rael. Because if you're wrong, you lose the throne. And if you're right but can't prove it, you lose the kingdom. Raelthorn stepped back. Let out a slow breath. I'm certain. Because of evidence or because of her? The question hung between them like a blade. Raelthorn could have lied, could have claimed pure objectivity, could have wrapped his answer in political necessity and strategic wisdom. Instead, he told the truth. Both. The evidence is damning, irrefutable. But yeah, she's part of it too, because she showed me what I'd become, what I'd been ignoring. You want to know the real reason I'm doing this? Torvald waited. Because sitting on that throne, surrounded by advisors telling me exactly what I wanted to hear, I stopped seeing people. Started seeing resources, numbers on reports, problems to manage instead of lives being destroyed. Raelthorn's hands clenched. Selene didn't just show me corruption, she showed me I'd become the kind of king who could let it happen without noticing. That's a dangerous admission, only if I'm wrong. And I'm not. Torvald studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Then let's burn it down properly. I'll have the evidence files ready. The witnesses are secured. One of them paused. Your Majesty, if this goes wrong, if Malric has support we haven't accounted for, then you know what to do. They both knew. Every captain knew. If the king fell, the succession protocols activated. Civil war followed. The empire they'd spent 8 years building would tear itself apart within months. Raelthorn picked up the crown, felt its weight settle over his temples like an old wound reopening. It won't go wrong. He walked toward the throne room. Behind him, Torvald murmured something too quiet to catch, but Raelthorn's enhanced hearing picked it up anyway. Famous last words. The throne room was packed. Every noble house, every council member, every magistrate and official who wielded even a fraction of power in the empire. They stood in clusters, whispering, speculating, their eyes tracking Raelthorn as he entered through the main doors. The conversations died like candles snuffed out. Raelthorn walked the length of the hall, alone. His footsteps echoed against marble. The crown felt heavier with each step. He ascended the platform, turned, sat. The throne room held its breath. Chancellor Malric Voren stood at the front of the assembly, composed as always. Perfectly dressed, perfectly postured, his expression showed exactly the right amount of concern mixed with loyalty. A masterclass in political performance. But Raelthorn saw past it now, saw the calculation behind those eyes. The predator wearing civilization like a costume. Your Majesty. Malric's voice carried across the hall, smooth as poisoned honey. The court is assembled as requested, though I confess we're uncertain about the nature of this emergency session. Raelthorn let the silence stretch, let the tension build until it had teeth. Then he spoke. For 8 years, I've sat on this throne believing I ruled justly, believing the empire I rebuilt from war and chaos had become something worth defending. I trusted my advisors, relied on reports filtered through channels designed to give me comfort instead of truth. He stood. I was wrong. The murmuring started immediately, nervous, confused. Raelthorn descended the steps, walked toward Malric with deliberate slowness. 1 week ago, I received reports. Anonymous. Detailed. Reports that claimed corruption had infected this empire at every level, that Omega families were disappearing, that children were being sold into debt slavery, that women were being branded as property beneath fabricated laws. Malric's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Just for a second. Your Majesty, surely these reports are the work of agitators seeking to— I investigated personally, Raelthorn cut him off. His voice went cold. I walked through my own capital disguised as a vagrant. I watched guards extort innocent Omegas. I watched magistrates sentence people to forced labor for crimes that didn't exist. I watched an empire I built with blood rot from the inside, while men I trusted profited from suffering. The throne room went absolutely silent. Raelthorn turned to address the full assembly, and at the center of this corruption, I found one name appearing again and again. One man whose influence touched every fabricated law, every falsified debt, every missing family. He looked back at Malric. Chancellor Voren. You're under arrest for crimes against the crown and the people of this empire." The explosion of noise was immediate. Nobles shouting, council members demanding explanation. Chaos rippling through the assembly like wildfire. Malrek's calm finally cracked. His face went pale, then red. "This is absurd. Your Majesty, I have served you faithfully for 8 years. Every policy, every law, every decision was made with your full knowledge and approval." "Was it?" Raelthorn's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Did I approve selling children into forced labor? Did I authorize guards to extort omegas for invented crimes? Did I sign off on debt schemes that enslaved entire families?" "Those are lies!" Malrek's composure shattered completely. "Fabrications from enemies of the state." "Really? Then explain this." Raelthorn gestured. Captain Torvald entered from the side chamber carrying a stack of documents. Behind him came 3 witnesses: an Omega woman, a former magistrate, a guard who'd been part of the extortion schemes. The woman stepped forward first. Her hand shook, but her voice held steady. "Chancellor Voren personally ordered my family's arrest. He said we owed debts we'd never incurred. When we couldn't pay, he sold my children to labor camps and had me branded as criminal property." She pulled down her collar. The brand mark was visible even from across the hall. Fresh. Deliberately cruel. The magistrate spoke next. His voice carried the hollow tone of someone who'd lived with shame too long. "I was ordered to fabricate charges against Omegas in the outer districts. Quotas. Chancellor Voren said the Empire needed workers for the expansion projects. When I refused, he threatened my family. So I complied. For 3 years, I sent innocent people to forced labor because I was too afraid to resist. The guard's testimony was shorter, blunter. We were told to collect protection fees from Omegas. Anyone who couldn't pay got arrested on fabricated violations. The money went directly to Chancellor Voren's private accounts. Everyone in the patrol knew. Everyone complied because refusing meant reassignment to the death squads on the border." Malrek's face had gone from red to white. His hands clenched at his sides. "These are coerced testimonies, bought with promises or threats. Your Majesty cannot possibly believe—" "I believe the evidence." Raelthorn nodded to Torvald. The captain opened the first document file. Started reading. Financial records showing transfers from the Imperial Labor Bureau to private accounts under Chancellor Voren's control. Total sum, 300,000 silver over 4 years. Legal codes modified without royal approval, creating new classifications of debt servitude. Correspondence between Chancellor Voren and magistrates in 7 districts, outlining quota systems for arrests and forced labor assignments. Property seizure records showing Omega families losing homes and assets to fabricated claims, with those properties later sold to nobles who made substantial donations to the Chancellor's political funds. Each piece of evidence hit like a hammer blow. The noble houses began shifting, moving away from Malrek, creating distance, political survival instinct kicking in as they realized the Chancellor was going down and anyone too close would fall with him. Raelthorn watched it happen with cold satisfaction, watched the Empire's power structures realign in real time as fear overrode loyalty. But Malrek wasn't finished. The Chancellor's eyes went wild, desperate. He looked around the throne room like a cornered animal searching for escape. Then his gaze locked onto something behind the assembly. Raelthorn followed the look, and his blood turned to ice. Selene stood at the back of the hall, flanked by royal guards. She wore a simple dress, out of place among the nobles and their silk and jewels. But her presence was a statement. The woman the king had risked everything to protect. Malrek's face twisted into something ugly. "You want to know the real corruption, Your Majesty?" His voice rose to a shout. "You disappeared from the palace for a week chasing after an Omega whore. You abandoned your duties as king to play beggar with a washerwoman. And now you're tearing apart this empire because she spread her legs and you lost what little sense you had left." Raelthorn moved before conscious thought. His alpha aura exploded through the throne room like a physical force. The temperature dropped. The air pressure changed. Wolves throughout the hall gasped, dropping to their knees as primal dominance crashed over them like a tidal wave. Malrek stumbled backward. His face went gray. Raelthorn closed the distance between them in 3 strides. Grabbed the Chancellor by the throat. Lifted him off his feet. "Say that again," Raelthorn whispered. His voice was barely human, Say one more word about her, and I will tear your throat out with my teeth in front of this entire court." Malrek choked, clawed at Raelthorn's hand, his eyes bulged. The rational part of Raelthorn's mind screamed warnings. This was too far, too public, too uncontrolled. Kings didn't lose their temper. Kings didn't let emotions override strategy. But the wolf didn't care about strategy. The wolf only knew someone had threatened its mate. "Your Majesty!" Torvald's voice cut through the red haze. "Your Majesty, he's not worth it!" Raelthorn held Malrek suspended for another heartbeat. 2. Let the fear sink in deep. Then he dropped him. The Chancellor collapsed to the marble floor, gasping. Raelthorn straightened, forced control back over his body. His wolf prowled beneath his skin, still snarling, still demanding blood. He addressed the throne room, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Chancellor Malrek Voren is stripped of all titles and authority. He will be held in the royal dungeons pending formal trial. Every law he passed without my direct approval is hereby suspended pending review. Every magistrate who participated in his schemes will face investigation." The assembly stayed silent, terrified, smart. And to be absolutely clear, Raelthorn's eyes swept across every noble, every counselor, every official present. "The woman you just heard insulted is under my personal protection. Anyone who speaks against her, anyone who threatens her, anyone who even looks at her wrong will answer to me directly." He let that sink in. Then he turned and walked back to the throne, sat down, and realized he was shaking, not from fear, from the effort of restraining the wolf, from the horrible realization that he'd just nearly committed murder in front of the entire imperial court because someone insulted Selene. That was the moment Raelthorn understood the terrible truth about power. Crowns are not symbols of strength. Crowns are restraints, chains designed to keep kings from becoming the monsters they're capable of being. And when rulers forget restraint, when they let emotion override duty, when they value one person more than the stability of an empire, kingdoms burn. The throne room emptied slowly. Nobles filed out in shocked silence. Council members huddled in nervous groups, already calculating how to protect themselves from the fallout. Guards escorted Malrek to the dungeons, the once powerful chancellor now just another prisoner. Raelthorn sat alone on the throne, crown heavy, armor heavier. Then he heard footsteps. Selene walked toward him across the empty hall. The guards had released her. She moved with the same careful grace he'd seen in the stables, like someone used to making herself small in dangerous spaces. She stopped at the base of the platform, looked up at him. "That was stupid," she said quietly. Raelthorn almost laughed. "Yeah. You nearly killed him, in front of everyone." "Yeah. Because he insulted me." "Yeah." Selene climbed the steps, stood directly in front of the throne. Eye level now because he was sitting and she was standing, and somehow that felt significant. "I don't need you to defend my honor," she said. "I've survived worse than words from men like him." "I know." "Then why?" Raelthorn looked at her, really looked, at the woman who'd given him bread and water and truth when he'd had nothing to offer but lies. "Because hearing him call you that made me want to burn the world down," he said simply. "And that terrifies me. Because kings aren't supposed to care that much. Kings are supposed to value stability over feelings, strategy over emotion, the empire over one person." He stood, moved closer to her. "But I don't. I value you more than all of it. More than the throne. More than the crown. More than the peace I spent 8 years building. And that makes me dangerous in ways I never was before." Selene's expression softened. Her hand came up to rest against his armored chest. "You're an idiot," she murmured. "Probably. A powerful, terrifying idiot who just made himself vulnerable in front of every noble in the empire." "Definitely." Her fingers curled into his armor. "And I still don't know if I can trust you." The words hit harder than any blade. Raelthorn covered her hand with his. "I know. And I'll spend however long it takes proving I meant what I said. That you're not a political tool or a conquest. That I see you as equal. As..." "Mate," Selene finished. Her eyes met his. "Your wolf recognized me. I felt it, even before you revealed yourself. You knew?" "I suspected." Her smile was sad. "Animals always knew things about me before people did. Your wolf saw something my human self didn't want to believe." And now? Now I'm standing in a throne room where the king just threatened to murder his chancellor for insulting a washerwoman. Selene's voice dropped to a whisper. Now I'm terrified that this isn't real, that tomorrow you'll wake up and realize you made a mistake, that I'm not worth the war this is going to cause. Raelthorn pulled her closer, rested his forehead against hers. You're worth more than you know. And the war's already started. What do you mean? He meant the nobles already plotting in private chambers, the allied houses reconsidering their treaties, the power structures throughout the empire beginning to shift and crack as word spread about what happened in the throne room. He meant Malrek's supporters who wouldn't go down quietly, who'd see this as an opportunity to seize power while the king was distracted by an Omega nobody. He meant the fundamental restructuring of imperial law that would have to happen. The corruption so deep it required tearing down foundations and rebuilding from scratch. But most of all, he meant the choice he'd made, the choice that put Selene above everything else, the choice that made him vulnerable in ways kings couldn't afford to be. It means, Raelthorn said carefully, that everything changes now. The empire I rebuilt is going to fight me every step of the way. Nobles will rebel. Allies will abandon us. Assassination attempts will get worse before they get better. He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. And if you choose to walk away, I won't stop you. You didn't ask for any of this. Didn't ask to become a political target. Didn't ask for a mate who comes with a crown and 1,000 enemies. Selene was quiet for a long moment. Then she laughed, bitter and broken, and somehow still beautiful. Walk away? To what? The outer districts where guards know my face? The empire that already tried to enslave me? I don't have anywhere to go, Rael. I haven't had anywhere to go since my parents died. That's not a reason to stay. No, but this is. She kissed him, hard, desperate, like someone choosing certainty over safety. When they broke apart, she kept her hands fisted in his armor. I'm staying because you're the first person who looked at me and saw something more than a convenient victim. Because you risked your throne to expose corruption instead of maintaining comfortable lies. Because when that bastard insulted me, you lost control in a way that told me exactly how much I actually matter to you. Her voice went fierce. So, yeah, I'm terrified. And I don't fully trust you yet. And I think you're going to get us both killed. But I'm staying anyway. Because for the first time in 6 years, I have something worth fighting for instead of just surviving. Raelthorn felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been locked down since the day he'd taken the throne and learned that power meant isolation. You're going to be my queen, he said. Not as decoration, as partner, as equal. You'll have authority over imperial law, voice in council decisions, real power. I'm a washerwoman who can barely read. You understand people better than anyone I've met. You see through lies. You have instincts that can't be taught. Raelthorn's hands framed her face. And you're the only person in this empire brave enough to tell me when I'm wrong. That's a low bar. It's everything. She smiled. That fragile, dangerous smile that made his wolf howl with recognition. Then, I guess we're doing this. Yeah. The apocalypse by choice. The best kind. They stood together on the platform, thrown at their backs, empire stretching out before them. And neither of them noticed the shadow moving in the upper gallery. Didn't notice the figure watching with hatred burning cold and patient. Didn't notice Malrek's most loyal supporter calculating exactly how to turn the king's new weakness into opportunity. What? 3 days later, the first assassination attempt happened in the royal gardens. Raelthorn survived because his wolf sensed the archer a half-second before the arrow released. He twisted. The bolt meant for his heart buried itself in his shoulder instead. Pain exploded through his body. He went down hard, blood spreading across expensive silk. Guards swarmed immediately, locked down the palace, hunted for the attacker who'd already vanished into the servant passages. Selene found him in the infirmary, pale and shaking as healers dug the arrowhead from muscle and bone. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him and held his hand while he gritted his teeth against agony. When it was over, when the healers left and they were alone, Raelthorn spoke first. This is going to keep happening. They'll keep coming. Everyone who profited from the old system, everyone who sees you as the weakness they can exploit. I know, You could still leave. I'd protect you, give you resources, a new identity in a different territory where... No. Selene's voice was iron. We already had this conversation. I'm not running, not from this, not from you. Even when it gets us killed, even then. Raelthorn stared at her. At this woman who should have been nobody, who should have stayed invisible in the outer districts, washing clothes and surviving day to day until the Empire consumed her completely. Instead, she sat beside him with blood on her hands from his wound and determination carved into every line of her face. Tell me about your brother, he said quietly. Selene blinked. What? Lucian? You said he can't shift, that the Empire treats him like he's defective. Tell me about him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, and her voice carried the weight of years. He's brilliant, smarter than anyone I've ever met. He can calculate trade routes in his head, knows every healing herb that grows in the northern territories, reads faster than I can turn pages. But because he can't shift, the guilds won't accept him. The trades won't train him. The Empire sees him as broken instead of different. Where is he now? Safe house. Under guard. She met Raelthorn's eyes. Your guard. You protected him the day after the throne room confrontation. Didn't tell me. Just had him moved to secure quarters and assigned tutors. He's your family. That makes him mine. Selene's eyes went bright. She looked away quickly. He's afraid of you, you know. Thinks you're going to use me and throw me away when political convenience demands it. Smart kid. Raelthorn. Her voice held warning. He's right to be afraid. I'm a king who just upended an empire for an Omega washerwoman. Half the nobility thinks I've lost my mind. The other half is calculating how to profit from the chaos. And somewhere in the middle of all this political nightmare, I'm supposed to convince your brother that I actually care about you beyond strategic value. Do you? The question hung between them. Raelthorn could have deflected, could have wrapped the answer in politics and power dynamics and careful diplomacy. Instead, he told the truth. I care about you in ways that terrify me, ways that make me vulnerable, ways that will probably get both of us killed before this is over. His hand tightened on hers. But yeah, I care. More than I've cared about anything since I took this throne. Selene leaned in, kissed him softly. Then we'll figure it out together. The political nightmare, the assassination attempts, the empire that wants me dead. All of it. Together sounds terrifying. Good. I like you terrified. Makes you honest. Raelthorn almost laughed. Then pain lanced through his shoulder and he hissed instead. Selene stood, adjusted the bandages with practiced efficiency. Rest. I'll stay until you fall asleep. You don't have to eat. Yes, I do. Because if I leave and another assassin shows up, you're too stubborn to call for help until you're already dying. Fair point. She settled back into the chair, kept holding his hand, and as Raelthorn drifted towards sleep, painkillers finally kicking in, he heard her whisper something that cut straight through his defenses. I'm scared, Rael. I'm so scared this won't end well. He wanted to reassure her, wanted to promise everything would work out, that love and determination would overcome politics and power. But he'd spent too many years in war to believe pretty lies. So he just squeezed her hand tighter and hoped it would be enough. The council meeting 3 days later was a war zone dressed in diplomatic language. Noble houses from across the empire had sent representatives, some to pledge loyalty, most to demand explanation for the chaos consuming their territories. Lord Garrett of House Malther spoke first, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. Your Majesty's recent decisions have destabilized trade agreements throughout the Eastern Territories. The sudden suspension of labor contracts has left projects unfinished, debts unpaid, chaos where there was order. Order, Raelthorn repeated coldly. Is that what you call forced servitude? Debt slavery? Children sold to pay fabricated claims? Garrett's expression didn't change. I call it economic necessity. The Empire requires labor to function. If Your Majesty dismantles the systems that provide that labor without offering alternatives, then we'll build new systems, systems that don't require treating people as property. Idealistic. Lord Garrett's tone dripped condescension. And economically unsustainable. Your Majesty rebuilt this empire through strength and pragmatism, not sentiment. The words landed like a gauntlet thrown. Raelthorn stood, walked around the council table with deliberate slowness. Let me make something absolutely clear. The empire I rebuilt was supposed to be better than what came before. Stronger, fairer, a place where strength didn't automatically grant the right to exploit the weak. His eyes locked onto Garrett. If that vision makes me idealistic, so be it. But any house that can't function without slavery doesn't deserve to function at all. The room went silent. Lord Garrett's face flushed red. And the Omega? The washerwoman? Your Majesty seems determined to elevate beyond her station. What happens when the novelty wears off and you realize she brings nothing to this empire except complications? Before Raelthorn could respond, the council chamber doors opened. Selene walked in. She wore a dress provided by the royal seamstresses. Simple but elegant. Her hair was braided in the traditional style of noble houses. She looked every inch a lady, despite her background. But what stopped every conversation in the room wasn't her appearance. It was her presence. She moved with quiet confidence, met the stares of powerful nobles without flinching, walked directly to the council table and stood beside Raelthorn like she had every right to be there. Lord Garrett, she said quietly. Her voice carried despite its softness. You asked what I bring to this empire. The answer is perspective. I've lived in the districts your policies destroyed, watched families torn apart by fabricated debts, seen children die from preventable illnesses because your economic necessity deemed healthcare too expensive for the poor. Garrett opened his mouth. Selene cut him off. I bring the voice of everyone you've spent your career ignoring, the Omegas you've exploited, the families you've enslaved, the people whose suffering funded your trade agreements and unfinished projects. Her eyes went hard. So when you ask what I offer this empire, the answer is simple. I offer truth. And you're terrified of it. The silence was absolute. Then Lady Myron of House Silcrest started laughing. It was delighted, genuine. Oh, I like her. The elderly noblewoman's eyes sparkled with approval. Finally, someone with spine in this chamber. Your Majesty, I withdraw my objections to the Chancellor's arrest. Anyone who hates this girl clearly deserves investigation. Other nobles began murmuring, not all in agreement, but the dynamic had shifted. Selene had just done in 30 seconds what would have taken Raelthorn hours of political maneuvering. She'd made the opposition look weak. The meeting continued. Debates about economic restructuring, arguments about legal reform, discussions about how to transition away from debt servitude without collapsing the empire's infrastructure. Selene participated, asked questions that cut straight to the heart of issues, offered solutions based on lived experience rather than theoretical policy. And slowly, grudgingly, some of the nobles began listening, not all of them. Lord Garrett left halfway through, face thunderous with rage. Several others followed, but enough stayed. Enough recognized that change was coming whether they liked it or not. Enough decided betting on the king's new direction was safer than opposing it. When the meeting finally adjourned, Raelthorn and Selene walked back to the royal chambers together. Guards flanked them at a respectful distance. You didn't have to do that, Raelthorn said quietly. Yes, I did. You can't fight this alone, and they needed to see I'm more than just your convenient weakness. You're not a weakness. Selene smiled sadly. That's not what they think. And until I prove otherwise, every noble in that chamber will see me as the Omega who corrupted their king. Let them. We'll prove them wrong together. They reached the chambers, dismissed the guards. Inside, away from watching eyes and political maneuvering, Raelthorn pulled Selene close. Thank you, he murmured against her hair. For what? For being exactly who you are. For not trying to become someone else to fit what they expect. She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. I can't be anything else. I'm just me. A washerwoman who accidentally became important because the king decided I mattered. You matter because you're extraordinary. The washerwoman part is irrelevant. Tell that to the nobles who want me dead. Raelthorn's expression went dark. They won't touch you. You can't watch me every second. Watch me try. She laughed. It was bitter and beautiful and somehow hopeful despite everything. You're impossible. And you're stuck with me. Lucky me. They stood together in the fading light, holding each other like the world outside wasn't falling apart, and neither of them saw the message being delivered to Lord Garrett's estate. Neither of them knew about the emergency meeting being arranged. Neither of them realized the opposition wasn't defeated. It was just getting started. The attack came at midnight 2 weeks later. Raelthorn woke to the sound of breaking glass and Selene's scream. He rolled out of bed, already shifting, his wolf erupting through skin and bone with practiced violence. The bedroom door exploded inward. 3 assassins in black armor poured through. Raelthorn met them with fangs and fury. Blood sprayed across expensive carpet. Bodies hit walls hard enough to crack stone. His wolf tore through them like they were paper, primal dominance, overwhelming trained killers. But they weren't after him. Raelthorn realized it too late. The window shattered. 2 more assassins crashed through, grabbed Selene before she could scream again. Raelthorn lunged, crossed the room in a heartbeat. Not fast enough. They went through the window with Selene between them, rappelling down the palace wall with professional efficiency. Raelthorn followed without thinking, jumped through the broken window. 3 stories up. Gravity pulled hard. He hit the ground in wolf form, rolled, came up running. The assassins were fast, enhanced, probably drugged for speed and strength. But Raelthorn was fury incarnate. He caught the first one within 50 yards, tore his throat out without slowing. The second tried to fight, died screaming. The third had Selene, blade pressed to her throat, backing toward the palace gates. "Shift back," the assassin commanded, voice distorted by a helmet. "Shift back or she dies." Raelthorn forced the transformation. Stood naked in the courtyard, blood dripping from his hands. His eyes never left Selene. She looked terrified, but not helpless. Her hand moved, subtle, deliberate. The assassin noticed too late. Selene drove her elbow backward into his ribs. Twisted, dropped beneath his guard with the kind of movement that came from years of surviving dangerous situations. The blade slashed air where her throat had been. Raelthorn moved. He covered the distance before the assassin could recover. Grabbed the man's helmet, twisted hard, bones snapped like kindling. The assassin dropped. Raelthorn pulled the helmet off and froze. It wasn't a trained killer, wasn't a professional assassin. It was a palace guard. Someone Raelthorn had seen dozens of times. Someone who was supposed to protect the royal family. Guards flooded the courtyard. Captain Torvald at the lead, face grim. "Secure the area. Check every passage. I want every guard accounted for within the hour." Raelthorn barely heard him. He stared at the dead man at his feet. "How deep does this go?" he whispered. Torvald's expression said everything. "Deep enough that we can't trust anyone." Selene stood shaking in her nightdress, arms wrapped around herself. Raelthorn moved to her immediately, pulled her against his chest. "You're okay. You're safe." She laughed. It came out broken. "Safe? Rael, they came through our bedroom window. Palace guards tried to kill me. How is that safe? It's not." Raelthorn's voice went hard. "But it ends now. How?" He looked at Torvald. "Call an emergency council meeting. Every noble house. Every territory leader. Everyone who has power in this empire. Your Majesty, the sun isn't even up yet. I don't care. Get them here within the hour. Anyone who refuses gets branded a traitor." Torvald hesitated, then nodded. "What are you planning?" Selene asked quietly. Raelthorn met her eyes. "War. Real war. Not political maneuvering, not careful diplomacy. I'm going to force every house to choose a side, publicly. Tonight. Either they stand with us or they stand against us. That's insane. You'll fracture the empire. The empire's already fractured. I'm just making it official." She stared at him. At the king covered in blood, standing in a courtyard surrounded by dead traitors. "You're really doing this?" "Yeah." "No going back after this point?" "No." Selene took a deep breath. Then she straightened, pulled away from his embrace. "Then I'm standing with you, in front of the entire council, as your mate. Your equal. Let them see exactly who they're opposing." Raelthorn felt pride and terror war inside him. "That will make you a target. I'm already a target. At least this way, I'm a target they can't ignore." He pulled her close again, kissed her hard. "You're going to get us killed." "Probably." Her smile was fierce. "But at least we'll die fighting instead of hiding." Dawn broke over the capital in shades of blood and gold, and the empire held its breath, waiting for the king to declare war on everyone who'd betrayed him. The council chamber filled before dawn like a mass grave accepting corpses. Nobles arrived with armed escorts. Territory leaders flanked by personal guards. Every house that held power in the empire crowded into a space designed for half their number. The air tasted like fear and expensive perfume trying to mask it. Raelthorn stood at the head of the chamber, still wearing clothes stained with blood from the courtyard fight. He hadn't bothered changing, wanted them to see exactly what their treachery had cost. Selene stood beside him, not behind, not hidden among servants or observers. Beside him, on the platform, visible proof of what this war was really about. The murmuring stopped when Raelthorn raised his hand. 3 hours ago, assassins broke into my private chambers. Palace guards turned traitor. They tried to abduct my mate while I slept. His voice was ice and iron. 4 men died in my bedroom, 3 more in the courtyard. All of them wore imperial uniforms. All of them swore oaths to protect the crown. The silence pressed down like a physical weight. So here's what's going to happen. Every house represented in this chamber will declare their position, publicly, right now. Either you stand with the reforms I'm implementing, or you stand against them. There is no middle ground anymore, no polite neutrality, no waiting to see which side wins. Lord Garrett stood from his seat near the back. His face was calm, but his hands trembled slightly. Your Majesty is asking us to choose between loyalty to the crown and economic survival. The reforms you've proposed will bankrupt half the noble houses in this empire. You're demanding we dismantle systems that have functioned for generations without offering viable alternatives. I'm demanding you stop treating people like livestock, Raelthorn shot back. If your economic survival requires slavery, your economy deserves to die. Pretty words from a king who's never had to manage trade routes or negotiate labor contracts. Garrett's voice rose. You sit on that throne issuing commands while the rest of us deal with reality, markets, resources, competition from territories that don't handicap themselves with sentiment. Sentiment. Raelthorn descended from the platform, walked toward Garrett with predatory focus. Is that what you call basic human decency? Sentiment? He stopped directly in front of the noble. Let me tell you about reality, Lord Garrett. The reality where children are sold to pay fabricated debts, where omegas are branded like cattle, where families disappear because corrupt officials decided they were more profitable as slaves than citizens. That's the reality your economic system created, and I'm burning it to the ground whether you like it or not. Garrett's composure cracked. And what happens when the empire collapses because you prioritized one omega's feelings over practical governance? What happens when territories rebel because their king chose weakness over strength? Then I'll put down the rebellions, Raelthorn said flatly, and anyone who stands with them dies. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Lady Myron spoke next. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd survived 3 kings and outlasted more ambitious nobles than anyone could count. Your Majesty, I supported you during the Unification Wars, backed your claim when others called you too young, too ruthless, too dangerous. But this? She gestured at Selene. This is suicide. You're gambling the Empire's stability on a mate bond that appeared at the most politically convenient moment possible. Raelthorn turned to face her. What are you implying? I'm stating facts. You announced reforms immediately after meeting this woman. Arrested your most trusted advisor, upended the entire imperial structure, all within weeks of forming a bond. She paused. Forgive my bluntness, Your Majesty, but it looks like manipulation. Like someone knew exactly how to exploit your wolf's instincts to gain power. The accusation hit like a blade between ribs. Raelthorn felt Selene stiffen beside him, felt the weight of every eye in the chamber turning toward her with suspicion. That's ridiculous, he started. Is it? Lord Garrett jumped back in, emboldened. A washerwoman from the outer districts suddenly becomes the center of the king's world. Suddenly has his ear on policy decisions. Suddenly stands beside the throne making demands of noble houses. His smile was poison. Either Your Majesty is the most gullible ruler in history, or someone played you perfectly. Selene stepped forward. Her voice cut through the noise like a knife through silk. You want to know if I manipulated him? Fine. Let's be clear about what actually happened. I gave a starving stranger bread and water. I let him sleep in a stable. I told him the truth about what I'd seen in the districts because I thought he was nobody important. Her eyes swept the chamber. I didn't know he was the king until guards tried to arrest me and he revealed himself. So if that's manipulation, I'm the worst conspirator in history. Pretty speech, Garrett sneered. Rehearsed, I'm sure. It's the truth. Prove it. The challenge hung there. Raelthorn opened his mouth to defend her, to shut down this line of questioning before it could poison more minds. But Selene spoke first. How? How exactly do I prove I didn't seduce the king for power when the king himself claims the bond is real? When he's standing right here confirming everything I say? She turned to face Raelthorn. You want proof I'm not using you? Then ask the one question that actually matters. What question? Selene's expression went hard. Would I stay if you lost the throne? The chamber went absolutely silent. Raelthorn stared at her, at this woman who'd become everything to him in weeks, who'd stood beside him through assassination attempts and political warfare, who'd faced down nobles with more courage than most soldiers showed on battlefields. And he realized something terrible. He didn't know the answer. Before he could speak, before he could even process what that meant, the chamber doors exploded inward. Captain Torvald stumbled through, armor dented, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. Your Majesty, his voice cracked. The western districts. They're burning. What? Rebels. Thousands of them. Armed with weapons from imperial arsenals, they're executing officials, burning magistrate offices. Torvald gasped for breath. And they're flying House Malther's banners. Every eye in the chamber turned to Lord Garrett. The noble's face had gone carefully neutral, too neutral. Raelthorn crossed the distance in 3 strides, grabbed Garrett by the throat. You. This was you. Garrett smiled. It was calm, satisfied. Not just me, Your Majesty. Half the noble houses in this empire. We've been planning this since you arrested Malrek, since you showed us exactly how weak you'd become. He didn't struggle against Raelthorn's grip, just kept talking. You want to know the truth? That Omega standing beside you? She didn't manipulate you, but we saw the opportunity she represented, saw how completely she compromised your judgment. Raelthorn's grip tightened. Garrett choked, but kept smiling. So we waited. Let you dig your own grave with reforms and rhetoric. Let you alienate every ally you had. And when you finally called this meeting, his eyes gleamed. We knew you'd be too distracted to notice the real threat. What threat? Garrett's smile widened. Then the second explosion hit. The palace shook, stone cracked. Screams erupted from outside the chamber. Torvald grabbed Raelthorn's arm. Your Majesty, we need to move. They've breached the outer walls. Who? Everyone who's sick of watching you destroy this empire for an Omega's approval. Raelthorn released Garrett, spun toward Selene. She stood frozen, face pale, as the reality crashed down around them. This was planned, all of it. The assassination attempts, the political pressure, the council meeting itself. Everything designed to gather the king and his allies in one place, while rebels seized the capital. Guards flooded the chamber, loyal ones, Torvald's hand-picked units. We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach this section, Torvald said rapidly. There's an escape route through the old siege tunnels. We can get you out of the city. No. Raelthorn's voice was steel. I'm not running for my own capital. Rael. Selene's hand found his. You have to. If you die here, the Empire dies with you. She's right, Torvald pressed. Your Majesty, this isn't about pride. If the rebels take you, they'll execute you publicly. Make an example. The Empire will fracture into civil war that could last decades. Raelthorn looked at the nobles still in the chamber, at Lord Garrett smiling like a man who'd already won, at Lady Myron watching with calculating eyes, at the territory leaders trying to decide which side offered better survival odds. And he realized the horrible truth. He'd lost, not on the battlefield, not through lack of strength or tactical failure. He'd lost because he'd made the one mistake no king could afford. He'd cared more about one person than the stability of the empire. Garrett saw it in his face, saw the moment Raelthorn understood. Too late, Your Majesty, the noble's voice carried satisfaction. You chose love over power, sentiment over strategy. And now you get to watch everything you built burn because you couldn't keep your wolf under control. Another explosion, closer this time. Your Majesty! Torvald grabbed his arm. Now! Raelthorn let himself be pulled toward the escape passage. Selene ran beside him, guards forming a protective circle. Behind them, Lord Garrett's laughter echoed through the collapsing chamber. The tunnels were dark, damp, built centuries ago for exactly this purpose. Escape routes for kings who'd lost control of their own palaces. Raelthorn had never imagined using them. They ran through passages that smelled like rot and failure. Above them, the palace shook with explosions. Screams filtered through stone, the sound of an empire tearing itself apart. "Where does this lead?" Selene gasped between breaths. "Safe house in the lower city," Torvald answered. "From there, we can reach the northern territories. Regroup. Build support for a counterattack." Raelthorn said nothing, just ran. Because if he stopped moving, he'd have to face what he'd done. He'd gambled an empire on a woman he'd known for weeks. And lost. They emerged from the tunnels into a warehouse district. Dawn light filtered through gaps in the roof. The safe house was 3 blocks away. "We're almost there," Torvald breathed. "Just a little further and—" The crossbow bolt took him in the chest. Torvald went down hard, blood spreading across his armor. Raelthorn caught him before he hit the ground, laid him down carefully. His captain's eyes were already glazing. "Should have listened to me." "About the girl," Torvald whispered. Blood bubbled at his lips. "Should have protected you from yourself." He died with accusation in his eyes. Raelthorn looked up. Assassins poured into the warehouse. Not palace guards this time. Professional killers. The kind noble houses hired for problems that required permanent solutions. Selene screamed. Raelthorn shifted. His wolf erupted through skin and bone with rage and grief powering the transformation. He tore into them like a force of nature, claws ripping through armor, fangs crushing throats, blood painting concrete and arterial sprays. But there were too many. For every one he killed, 2 more appeared. They had numbers, coordination, strategy. And they knew his weakness. One grabbed Selene, blade to her throat, the universal language of leverage. Raelthorn froze mid-strike. The lead assassin removed his helmet. It wasn't a stranger. It was Marcus, former palace guard. Someone Raelthorn had promoted personally 3 years ago for valor during the border conflicts. "Hello, Your Majesty." Marcus's voice held no emotion. "Nothing's personal, just business." Raelthorn forced himself back to human form, stood naked and bloody among corpses. "Let her go. Take me. I'll surrender. Just let her go." Marcus smiled. "No. See, the rebellion needs you dead, but keeping her alive, that's where the real money is." "What?" "Think about it. The Omega who corrupted the great Raelthorn Dreyke, who brought down an empire because the king couldn't resist a pretty face and a sad story." His smile widened. "Noble houses will pay fortunes to parade her through their territories. Living proof that even alpha kings fall to weakness. She'll be a cautionary tale for generations." Selene's eyes met Raelthorn's across the warehouse, and in that moment, he saw something that broke him more completely than any blade could. Fear. Not of Marcus, not of captivity or torture or being used as propaganda. Fear that everything Garrett and Lady Mirren had said was true. Fear that she really had destroyed him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. 2 words. Devastating in their sincerity. Because she meant it, actually believed this was her fault. Raelthorn's wolf howled inside him, not with rage, with recognition of what he had to do. The thing he'd spent weeks avoiding, the choice he'd known was coming since the moment he'd revealed himself in the throne room. He had to choose, empire or mate, power or love. The throne he'd built through blood and war and 8 years of sacrifice, or the woman who'd shown him what it meant to be human instead of just a crown. And the horrible truth was that there were no good options. If he saved Selene, the rebellion won. The empire fractured. Civil war consumed territories for decades. Millions died in the chaos. If he sacrificed her, he might salvage enough to rebuild, might rally loyal houses, might prevent total collapse. But he'd become exactly what she'd feared. Another powerful bastard who thought compassion was weakness and people were expendable. Marcus watched him calculate. Saw the moment Raelthorn reached the edge. "So what's it going to be, Your Majesty? The empire you built, or the Omega who destroyed it?" The assassins waited. 20 blades pointed at Raelthorn and Selene, 20 trained killers ready to end this however their employer demanded. And in the silence before the choice, Raelthorn heard Torvald's dying words echo. Should have protected you from yourself. His captain had been right. The greatest threat to any king wasn't external enemies or political rivals, or even betrayal from trusted advisors. It was the moment they discovered something they couldn't afford to lose. The moment power stopped being enough. The moment they became human instead of symbols. That was when empires fell. Not through conquest or revolution. Through love. Raelthorn looked at Selene, at this woman who'd given him bread and water and honesty when she thought he was nobody. Who'd stood beside him through political warfare and assassination attempts. Who'd faced down nobles with more courage than most warriors. Who'd never asked for any of this. Who'd just wanted to survive and protect her brother. And he made the choice that would define everything that came after. I'll trade myself for her, Raelthorn said quietly. Full surrender, no conditions. Let her go and I'll come peacefully. Rael, no! Selene struggled against the blade at her throat. Don't you dare! Don't throw away everything for you, Raelthorn finished. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. Marcus tilted his head, considering. Interesting. The rebellion wanted you dead, but delivering the Iron Alpha alive, broken and defeated? That's worth more than your corpse. He nodded slowly. Deal. But she doesn't go free. She gets exiled. Northern wastes, no resources, no protection. Let nature decide if she survives. Agreed. You're insane, Selene's voice cracked. Rael, you can't. I can, and I am. Raelthorn met her eyes across the warehouse. You asked if I'd choose you over the Empire. Here's your answer. He walked forward, hands raised, surrendering to men who would parade him as a cautionary tale, who would break him publicly to prove that even kings could fall. But Selene would live. Maybe she'd hate him for it. Maybe she'd spend the rest of her life believing she'd destroyed him. Maybe the guilt would consume her. But she'd be alive. And that was the only thing that mattered. Marcus gestured. 2 assassins moved forward with chains. Then everything exploded. Not metaphorically. Literally. The warehouse wall detonated inward. Stone and dust and chaos erupting through the space. Through the smoke came wolves, dozens of them. But not rebel forces. Not noble house guards. Omegas. From the outer districts. The workers, the washerwomen and laborers and forgotten people the Empire had spent generations exploiting. And at their head, wielding a sword like he'd been born to it despite never shifting, was Lucian, Selene's brother. The boy everyone had written off as defective, leading a rescue force of people who shouldn't have mattered. Lucian's voice cut through the chaos. Get my sister and the king out of here, now! The warehouse descended into violence. Omega fighters clashed with trained assassins. It should have been slaughter. The Omegas were untrained, desperate, fighting with improvised weapons and borrowed courage. But they had numbers, and rage, and the kind of determination that came from having nothing left to lose. Raelthorn shifted, joined the fight, tore through assassins alongside wolves who'd spent their lives being told they were too weak to matter. Selene broke free from Marcus's grip, grabbed a fallen blade, started fighting with the vicious efficiency of someone who'd survived 6 years of an empire trying to kill her. The battle was chaos, beautiful and terrible. And in the middle of it, Raelthorn caught Lucian's eye. The boy nodded, no words needed, just recognition. They fought their way out together, Omegas and Alpha Kings side by side, through warehouse corridors and into the streets where the capital burned. Behind them, Marcus screamed orders, but his forces were scattered, broken by an attack they'd never anticipated, by people they'd dismissed as irrelevant. They regrouped 3 blocks away. Omega fighters formed a protective circle around Raelthorn and Selene. Casualties were heavy. Blood stained the cobblestones. Lucian appeared at Selene's side. His arm hung at an odd angle. Broken, but his eyes were fierce. Told you I could fight, he said. Selene grabbed him, hugged him hard despite his injuries. You're an idiot, she sobbed. A brilliant, terrifying idiot, learned from the best. Raelthorn stared at them. At the rescue force of Omegas who'd just saved their king when every noble house in the Empire had abandoned him. At the people he'd been trying to protect who'd ended up protecting him instead. How? He asked Lucian. The boy met his gaze steadily. You gave me tutors. Protection. Treated me like I mattered instead of like I was broken. His voice went hard. So when word spread that the palace was burning and the king was betrayed, I called in every favor, every Omega you'd helped during your reforms, every family you'd freed from debt slavery, every person who'd benefited from the changes you were trying to make. He gestured at the fighters around them. Turns out, there's a lot of us, and we're tired of watching powerful people decide our lives don't matter. Raelthorn felt something shift inside him, something fundamental. He'd been trying to save the empire from the top down, through policy and law and royal authority, but the real power had always been at the bottom, with the people he'd been trying to protect, the ones everyone else had written off as irrelevant. Your Majesty. One of the Omega fighters approached, former soldier based on how he moved. The rebels control the palace and most of the noble districts, but the outer sectors are holding. We've got maybe 3,000 fighters, untrained but motivated. Against how many? The soldier grimaced. Rebel forces number around 15,000, plus whatever noble house guards join them. We're outmatched 5-1, maybe worse. Raelthorn looked at Selene, at the woman who'd destroyed and saved him in equal measure, at Lucian, who'd proven that strength had nothing to do with shifting abilities, at the Omega fighters who'd risked everything to rescue a king most of them had never met. And he made the second choice that would define everything. Then we don't fight them head on, we fight smart. We use what they don't expect. What's that? The soldier asked. Raelthorn smiled. It was sharp as broken glass. We use the people they've spent generations teaching to be invisible. We turn their own assumptions against them. We make them fight an enemy they can't see because they've trained themselves not to notice anyone they consider beneath them. He turned to address all the Omega fighters. You know this city better than any noble ever will. You know the passages, the hiding places, the routes they don't guard because they've never considered you a threat. His voice rose. We're going to use that. We're going to make them afraid. We're going to show them exactly what happens when the people they've exploited decide to fight back. The Omegas stared at him. Then Lucian started laughing. It was fierce and wild and utterly unafraid. You want to wage guerrilla war in your own capital. Use the people they've dismissed as the weapon they never saw coming. Exactly. Selene stepped forward. Her hand found Raelthorn's. You've lost your mind, she said, but there was approval in her voice. This is suicide. Probably. But it's the right kind of suicide, the kind that means something. She smiled, that broken, beautiful smile that had destroyed him from the start. Then let's burn it all down properly. Around them, Omega fighters raised their weapons, their voices. For the king who actually gave a damn. For the empire that should have been. For everyone they told us didn't matter. The roar echoed through the burning streets, and Raelthorn realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. He'd been trying to save an empire, but empires were just systems, structures, power arrangements that served whoever controlled them. What mattered were the people, the ones everyone else had decided were expendable, the ones who'd just proven they were anything but. If he died in the streets fighting alongside them, the empire would fall anyway. Civil war would consume it. But maybe that was the point. Maybe some empires deserved to fall. Maybe the only way to build something better was to let the old system burn completely. To start from the ashes with the people who'd always been there but never been seen. Raelthorn looked at Selene. No going back now, he said. Was there ever? No, probably not. They stood together in the burning capital, surrounded by Omegas ready to fight impossible odds. And somewhere in the palace, Lord Garrett smiled, believing he'd already won. Not knowing that the king he'd betrayed had just stopped being a king, had just become something far more dangerous. A leader who had nothing left to lose except the people fighting beside him. And men with nothing to lose don't follow the rules anymore. They make new ones, written in blood and fire and the screams of everyone who'd underestimated them. The war for the empire was over. The revolution had just begun. The outer districts burned with purpose instead of chaos. Raelthorn stood on a rooftop overlooking the capital as smoke rose in deliberate patterns. Signal fires. Coordinated strikes. The kind of tactical precision that shouldn't exist among untrained Omega fighters, but did anyway because desperation made people learn fast or die trying. 3 days since the warehouse. 3 days of guerrilla warfare that transformed the rebellion's certainty into paranoia. The nobles had expected a conventional counterattack, expected Raelthorn to gather loyal houses and march on the palace with banners flying and war horns announcing his presence like every king before him. Instead, he disappeared into the districts they'd spent generations ignoring, and the city started eating them alive. Supply convoys vanished between checkpoints. Officers were found dead in alleys with their throats cut, and no witnesses despite dozens of people living within earshot. Patrol routes that had been safe for decades became killing grounds where rebel soldiers went in 20 strong and 3 came out screaming. The Omegas fought like ghosts, like shadows with teeth, because that's what the Empire had trained them to be. Invisible, beneath notice. The kind of people powerful wolves looked through without seeing, now that invisibility had become a weapon. Selene appeared beside him on the rooftop. Her hands were stained with soot and blood. She'd been running supply lines through the underground passages, coordinating fighters who knew the city's bones better than any map. Lucien's group hit the Eastern Armory an hour ago, she reported. Got out with enough weapons to arm another 100 fighters. Casualties were light. Raelthorn nodded. The Western grain stores? Torched. Rebels are going to start starving in about a week unless they can resupply from outside the city. Good. He stared at the palace in the distance, lit up like a beacon of authority that meant nothing when the streets around it refused to comply. What about our people?
Tired. Scared. Selene's voice went quiet. We've lost 43 in 3 days, Rael. Every strike costs us. I know. And the rebel count? 216 confirmed dead. Maybe another 100 wounded badly enough to be combat ineffective. The math was brutal but clear. The rebels still had overwhelming numbers, still controlled the palace and noble districts, still had trained soldiers and house guards and resources. But they were bleeding. And more importantly, they were afraid. Fear was the real weapon here, not the kills or the supply disruptions or the territory they'd retaken. Fear that they couldn't hold a city where the population itself had turned hostile. Fear that every servant might be a spy, every delivery might be an ambush, every shadow might hide a blade. That was the thing about power built on exploitation. It required the exploited to cooperate, to accept their place, to stay invisible and compliant.
The moment they stopped, the whole system collapsed. Movement below caught Raelthorn's attention. Rebel patrol moving through the market square, 10 soldiers in formation, alert, weapons ready. They passed beneath their position without looking up, because looking up meant acknowledging the buildings where Omega workers lived. And powerful wolves didn't acknowledge Omega spaces. Raelthorn gestured. 2 Omega fighters emerged from concealment on the opposite roof, crossbows raised. They'd been waiting there for hours. The bolts dropped 2 rebels before the patrol realized they were under attack. The rest scattered, tried to find cover in a square designed to be open and defensible, but they designed it to defend against conventional armies. Not against people who knew every cellar entrance and drainage tunnel and hidden passage because they'd used them their entire lives to avoid notice. Omega fighters poured out of the shadows, 20 of them, 30. They swarmed the patrol like wolves, bringing down prey much larger than themselves. It was over in seconds. The square went silent again. Bodies dragged into alleys. Blood washed away with buckets of water kept ready for exactly this purpose. By the time the next patrol arrived, there was no evidence anything had happened, just empty cobblestones and the lingering sense that something was very wrong. That's the 4th patrol today, Selene murmured. They're going to stop sending small groups soon. Let them. Bigger groups move slower, make more noise. Easier to avoid or ambush depending on what we need. And when they stop patrolling altogether, then they're trapped in the districts they control, cut off from intelligence, from supply lines, from the reality of what's happening in their own city. Raelthorn's smile was cold, and that's when we start really hurting them. Below, Omega fighters melted back into the districts, back to their lives as washerwomen and laborers and servants, back to being invisible. Until the next signal fire, the next strike, the next reminder that the people they'd dismissed as irrelevant were killing them one patrol at a time. This is insane, Selene said, not arguing, just stating fact. You're waging war against an army 5 times your size with fighters who didn't know which end of a sword to hold 3 days ago. Yeah, we're going to lose. Probably. She turned to face him. Then why are we doing this? Raelthorn looked at her. At the woman who'd started this entire chain of events by giving a stranger bread and water, who'd shown him that compassion wasn't weakness, that the people at the bottom weren't irrelevant, that empires built on exploitation deserved to burn. Because win or lose, we're making them see us, he said quietly, making them acknowledge that the people they've exploited for generations are human beings who can fight back, who refuse to stay invisible anymore. That's not a strategy. That's a statement. Maybe that's more important than winning. Selene stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Maybe that's what happened when kings stopped caring about thrones and started caring about people instead. You've changed, she said finally. Yeah. The king I met in that stable wouldn't have said that, wouldn't have prioritized meaning over victory. The king you met in that stable was blind. Raelthorn's voice went rough. Thought power meant controlling things. Thought leadership meant making hard choices and accepting necessary evils. Thought the empire's stability was worth any price. And now I think some prices are too high. Some systems are too broken to fix. Some empires need to fall so something better can grow from the ashes, even if we die in the process. Especially then, because at least we'll die fighting for something real instead of maintaining comfortable lies. Selene was quiet for a long moment. Then she moved closer. Her hand found his. I'm still scared. Good. Fear means you're paying attention. I'm scared you're going to get everyone killed for a moral victory that won't matter once we're all dead. Maybe. Raelthorn pulled her against him. But I'd rather die fighting beside you and Lucian and every Omega down there who refused to stay invisible than live as the king who kept his throne by ignoring their suffering. That's the mate bond talking. The wolf making you irrational. No. It's me finally understanding what strength actually means. His arms tightened around her. Strength isn't domination. It's not control or fear or the ability to force compliance. Real strength is standing with people who have nothing and fighting anyway. It's choosing principle over pragmatism. It's becoming the kind of leader worth following instead of just obeying. Selene pulled back enough to meet his eyes. You're going to get us killed, she repeated. But there was something different in her voice now. Not agreement, not quite hope. Acceptance. The kind of acceptance that came from realizing there were worse things than dying, like living as a coward, like surviving by compromising everything that made survival worthwhile. Then let's die loud, she said. Yeah, let's die loud. They stood together on the rooftop as the city burned below, as Omega fighters prepared for another night of strikes, as the rebellion that controlled the palace started to understand they'd won the battle but were losing the war that actually mattered, the war for the soul of the empire itself. Baki, the message arrived at dawn. One of the Omega scouts brought it, a formal declaration written on expensive parchment with Lord Garrett's seal pressed into red wax. Raelthorn read it once, twice, then looked up at the assembled fighters crowding the warehouse they'd turned into headquarters. They want to negotiate, he said flatly. The room erupted, shouts of disbelief, anger, suspicion. Lucian pushed through the crowd. His arm was still in a sling, but he moved like a predator anyway. It's a trap. Obviously, Raelthorn agreed. They're losing control of the city, losing soldiers every day. They need to end this before their position becomes completely untenable. So what do? Selene asked. We go anyway. The room went silent. Well, that's suicide, she said carefully. Probably. But if we don't, they'll just keep fighting, keep bleeding the city, keep killing our people. He looked around at the Omega fighters, at people who'd trusted him enough to risk everything. We end this one way or another, either through negotiation or through forcing them into a final confrontation they can't walk away from. What are the terms? One of the fighters called out. Raelthorn read from the parchment. Single combat between myself and their champion. Neutral ground. If I win, the rebellion surrenders and faces trial. If they win, the Omega forces disperse and I'm executed publicly. That's insane, Lucian's voice cracked. You can't. I can and I will, Raelthorn cut him off, because it gets their leadership in one place, gets them out from behind their walls and soldiers, makes them vulnerable. You think they'll honor the terms if you win? Selene's voice was ice. They've already betrayed every oath they ever swore. Why would single combat be different? It won't be. Raelthorn smiled. That's why we're not planning on honoring them either. He spread a map of the city across the table, pointed to the meeting location they'd specified. The old amphitheater in the neutral district between Noble and Omega territories. They'll bring their leadership, their champion, probably guards disguised as witnesses. His finger traced routes around the location. We bring fighters hidden in every building surrounding the arena, every tunnel entrance, every high point. An ambush, Lucian said slowly. You're going to use the single combat as bait. Exactly. They think they're drawing me into a trap. Really, they're walking into ours. What's stopping them from doing the same thing? Nothing. Raelthorn's grin was all teeth. Which means it comes down to who executes better, who planned more carefully, who wants it more. This is madness, one of the older Omega fighters muttered. Yeah, but it's the right kind of madness, the kind that ends wars instead of prolonging them. Raelthorn looked around the room, met every eye, saw the fear there, the exhaustion, the desperate hope that somehow this impossible situation would resolve into something survivable. He couldn't promise them that. Couldn't guarantee anything except more violence and blood, and the very real possibility they'd all be dead before sunset. But he could give them the truth. This is it, he said quietly. Everything we've fought for, everyone we've lost. It all comes down to this one confrontation. We win, and maybe we get a chance to rebuild something better. We lose, and at least we die fighting instead of on our knees. His voice rose. So I need you to be honest with yourselves right now. If you're not willing to risk everything, walk away. No judgment, no shame. Survival is a valid choice. Nobody moved. Not Selene, not Lucian, not a single Omega fighter in that warehouse. Because that's what happened when people discovered something worth dying for. When they stopped surviving and started living. When invisibility became intolerable and they chose to be seen no matter the cost. All right then. Raelthorn started assigning positions, detailing the plan, identifying key targets among the rebel leadership. And as dawnlight filtered through broken windows, an army of people who shouldn't matter prepared to face the forces that had exploited them for generations. With nothing but improvised weapons and borrowed courage and the absolute conviction that some things were worth dying for. Like dignity, like being seen, like proving that power wasn't destiny and strength came from solidarity instead of domination. The kind of revolution that couldn't be stopped with soldiers or laws or political maneuvering, because it lived in the hearts of people who decided they'd rather die standing than live kneeling. Bayekt. The amphitheater was ancient, pre-empire, built when the territories were separate kingdoms and combat was how disputes got resolved before they became wars. Raelthorn entered through the main gates at noon. The sun was directly overhead. No shadows. Nowhere to hide. Perfect conditions for an execution masquerading as honor combat. The rebel leadership waited on the far side. Lord Garrett at the center. Lady Myron beside him. Territory leaders who'd thrown their support behind the rebellion. Guards in formation. Weapons ready but not drawn. Following the forms. Maintaining the fiction that this was legitimate. And standing in the center of the arena was their champion. Marcus. The assassin who'd nearly killed Selene in the warehouse, who'd walked away from that fight while Raelthorn was escaping with Omega fighters. Now he stood in full armor, sword drawn, smile visible even from across the arena. Raelthorn walked forward alone. No armor, no weapon except the knife at his belt, because this wasn't about winning the fight, it was about getting close enough. Lord Garrett's voice carried across the arena, amplified somehow, probably magic worked into the stones. Your Majesty, how kind of you to accept our invitation. Cut the pleasantries, Garrett. You wanted single combat. Here I am. Indeed. The noble smiled. Though I confess surprise. I expected you'd try something clever. Some desperate gambit befitting a king with nothing left to lose. Maybe I just want to end this. Really? No hidden Omega fighters? No ambush? Just you walking to your death with dignity? Raelthorn smiled. Something about it made Garrett's expression flicker. You'll find out soon enough. Marcus stepped forward, rolled his shoulders. The armor moved with him smoothly, expensive, the kind noble houses commissioned for champions they expected to win. Your Majesty, no hard feelings about the warehouse, just following orders. Yeah, I remember. Raelthorn started stripping off his shirt, exposed the scars from 8 years of war, from assassination attempts and border conflicts and the price of rebuilding an empire. You following orders now?
Of course. Marcus's smile widened. Lord Garrett wants you dead, preferably publicly, definitely painfully. So that's what you're getting. Fair enough. They circled each other. The arena went silent. Thousands of eyes watching from the surrounding buildings. Rebel soldiers, Omega civilians, everyone who had a stake in how this ended. And hidden among them, weapons ready, Raelthorn's people waited for the signal.
Marcus attacked first. Fast. Professional. The kind of strike designed to test defenses while committing to nothing. Raelthorn dodged, didn't counter, just moved. Let Marcus think he was defensive, scared, buying time. Let them all think that. The fight continued, Marcus pressing, Raelthorn giving ground, blood started flowing, shallow cuts. Nothing fatal, but enough to make it look real. Enough to make the rebel leadership relax. To believe their plan was working. That's when Selene stepped into the arena. Not from the entrance, from the shadows beneath the stands, where tunnel access gave Omega fighters routes the nobles never knew existed. She held a crossbow, aimed directly at Lord Garrett's head. The arena exploded into chaos. Rebel guards moved to intercept, drew weapons, formed defensive positions around their leaders, and from every building surrounding the amphitheater, Omega fighters emerged. Crossbows, swords, improvised weapons, hundreds of them, all pointed at the rebel leadership who'd walked into the trap thinking they were setting one. Raelthorn smiled at Marcus, stopped retreating. His entire posture changed, became something dangerous. Thanks for the warm-up, he said. Then he shifted. His wolf erupted through skin and bone with violence that made the arena stones crack. Massive, black as midnight, eyes burning with 8 years of restrained dominance finally unleashed. Marcus tried to run. Raelthorn's jaws closed around his throat before he made it 3 steps, crushed armor like paper, bit down until vertebrae separated with sounds like breaking branches. The champion died gurgling, armor useless, skill irrelevant, because this was never about honor combat. This was about vengeance. Raelthorn shifted back, stood over the corpse, blood dripping from his mouth, naked and uncaring. His voice carried across the silent arena. Lord Garrett, Lady Mirren, every noble who thought betraying me was smart politics. You made one critical mistake. Garrett's face had gone white. What mistake? You forgot what I was before I became king. Raelthorn walked toward them slowly. Guards raised weapons, but none moved to stop him, because his alpha aura was crushing the air out of the arena, making wolves drop to their knees. I was a warlord, a conqueror, the kind of alpha who unified territories by making everyone too terrified to resist. He stopped 10 feet from Garrett. I spent 8 years trying to be better than that, trying to rule with law instead of fear, with justice instead of domination. I thought that's what good kings did. His eyes went cold. But you didn't want a good king. You wanted power, wanted to keep your systems of exploitation no matter who it hurt. So you betrayed me. Tried to kill the one person who showed me there was more to leadership than fear. Raelthorn's wolf surged beneath his skin, made the temperature drop, made every wolf in the arena whimper. Now you get to learn what happens when you take restraint away from someone who was never peaceful, just controlled. Selene's voice cut through the tension. Rael, don't! He looked at her, at the woman who'd given him bread and water, and shown him compassion when she had nothing. They deserve to die, he said quietly. Probably. But not like this. Her eyes held his. Not as revenge, not as rage. If we execute them here, we're just perpetuating the same cycle. Power through violence, strength through fear. She lowered the crossbow. You wanted to build something better, something that didn't require exploitation or terror. She gestured at the Omega fighters surrounding the arena. These people followed you because you showed them a different way, because you chose principle over pragmatism. Her voice went fierce. Don't throw that away now. Don't become the monster they expected you to be all along. Raelthorn stared at her, at this woman who'd destroyed and saved him, who kept pulling him back from edges he didn't know he was standing on. Around them, the arena held its breath. Garrett found his voice, shaking but defiant. You think mercy will save you? You think letting us live means we won't just regroup and try again? Probably, Raelthorn agreed. But that's not why I'm doing it. Then why? Because she's right. If I kill you here, I'm just proving your point. That power comes from violence, that strength means domination, that the Empire's just whoever holds the biggest threat. He turned to address the entire arena. Everyone watching from buildings and stands and hidden positions. We're not doing that anymore. We're building something different. Something where power comes from accountability instead of fear, where strength means protecting people instead of exploiting them. His voice rose. So here's what's happening. Lord Garrett and every noble who supported this rebellion will face trial. Real trial, with evidence and witnesses and laws that apply equally regardless of status. If they're guilty, they face consequences. If they can somehow prove innocence, they walk free. That's your revolution? Garrett sneered. Trials? Laws? You think that changes anything? No. What changes things is that you'll face the judgment of the people you've spent generations exploiting. Raelthorn's smile was sharp. The Omegas you dismissed as irrelevant will sit in judgment, will determine your fate, will show you exactly what accountability looks like when the powerless suddenly have voice. Around the arena, Omega fighters raised their weapons, not in threat, in affirmation. This was the revolution. Not violence, not revenge. Justice administered by those who'd been denied it longest. Lady Myron stepped forward. Her voice was steady despite the crossbows aimed at her chest. And if we refuse, if our houses don't accept this new order, then you'll be fighting not just me, but every Omega in this empire. Raelthorn gestured at the fighters surrounding them. Every washerwoman and laborer, and person you've treated as invisible. They're not invisible anymore. They've tasted power, tasted what it means to fight back. He met her eyes. You can't put that back in the bottle. You can't make them disappear again. So either you adapt to a world where they matter, or you get swept away by people who refuse to be dismissed. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, Lord Garrett lowered his head. Not surrender, not quite, but acknowledgement. The fight was over. Not because Raelthorn had won through violence, not because he'd killed everyone who opposed him, because he'd shown them a future where the old rules didn't apply anymore, where power structures built on exploitation couldn't survive populations that refused to comply. And the nobles, pragmatic to their cores, recognized inevitability when they saw it. Selene appeared at Raelthorn's side, handed him a shirt. He pulled it on gratefully. The adrenaline was fading, exhaustion setting in. That was stupid, she murmured, and brilliant, and absolutely insane. Yeah, that's becoming my style, apparently. You could have killed them all, made it clean. Could have. But then we'd just be trading one tyranny for another. Same system with different people at the top. So what happens now? Raelthorn looked around the arena, at Omega fighters and rebel soldiers and nobles who'd just watched their world change fundamentally. Now we figure out what comes after revolution. The hard part. Building something new instead of just tearing down the old. That's going to take years. Yeah, most of us will probably die before it's finished. Probably. Selene smiled. That tired, beautiful smile that had started this entire chain of events. Then I guess we better get started. Around them, the capital began exhaling. The tension that had held the city in a chokehold for weeks finally releasing. Guards started lowering weapons. Omega fighters began securing the rebel leadership for transport to holding cells. The machinery of justice starting to turn. And in the center of it all, Raelthorn stood beside the woman who'd shown him that strength had nothing to do with domination and everything to do with choosing principle over convenience. Lucian appeared through the crowd, his arms still in a sling, but his eyes bright. The outer districts are secure. No resistance. I think word's spreading about what happened here. Good. Get medical teams to anyone who needs them, rebel soldiers included. Your Majesty, they tried to kill you, and now they're prisoners awaiting trial. We treat them like people, that's the whole point. Lucian shook his head. You're either the wisest king in history or the most naive. Haven't decided which yet. Neither have I, Raelthorn admitted. Ask me in 10 years, if we survive that long. Yeah, if we survive. The boy left to organize the occupation, left Raelthorn and Selene standing together in the arena that had nearly become their tomb. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. "That we just started something we might not be able to finish. That mercy might have been a mistake. That showing restraint to people who wanted us dead could come back to destroy everything. But you did it anyway." "Yeah." "Why?" Raelthorn pulled her close. "Because you were right. Because building something better requires being better. Because I'd rather die trying to create a just empire than live as the tyrant who maintained an unjust one through fear." He kissed the top of her head. "And because you make me want to be the kind of king worth following instead of just obeying." Selene looked up at him. Her eyes held something complicated. Fear and pride and exhaustion and hope tangled together. "We're going to fail," she said. "The system's too broken. Too many people profit from inequality. Too much resistance from houses that would rather burn the empire down than share power." "Probably. And we're going to die trying, almost certainly. But we're doing it anyway." "Yeah, we're doing it anyway." They stood together as the sun began setting, as the capital's buildings cast long shadows across stone still stained with blood from 3 days of guerrilla warfare. As an empire built on exploitation began the slow, agonizing process of becoming something better. And somewhere in the palace, in holding cells designed for criminals, Lord Garrett stared at the walls and calculated his next move. Because nobles who'd spent lifetimes accumulating power didn't surrender it just because they'd lost one battle. They adapted, plotted, waited for the next opportunity. And the king who'd shown mercy instead of executing them had just given them all the time they needed. The war was over, but the real fight was just beginning. The trials began 3 weeks after the amphitheater. Not in the throne room. That would have been too symbolic. Too much like the old empire dispensing judgment from on high while the accused stood below in positions designed to remind them of their powerlessness. Instead, Raelthorn ordered them held in the old guild hall. Neutral ground. Benches arranged in a circle instead of tiers. Every seat at the same level. Accused and accusers and judges sharing the same floor. It was a small thing, symbolic maybe. But symbols mattered when you were trying to rebuild an empire's soul. The Council of Judges was deliberately mixed. 3 Omega representatives elected from the districts. 3 nobles who'd remained neutral during the rebellion. 3 scholars with expertise in imperial law. And Raelthorn himself, not as king dispensing edicts, but as one voice among many. The first trial lasted 4 days. Lord Garrett stood accused of corruption, conspiracy, and crimes against the empire. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, testimonies from magistrates he'd bribed, Omega families he'd destroyed. The paper trail of suffering stretched back years. His defense was simple, brutal in its honesty. "I did what was necessary to maintain order. Every system requires hierarchy, requires people at the bottom to support those at the top. That's not corruption. That's civilization." One of the Omega judges leaned forward. Her name was Marta. She'd lost 2 children to Garrett's debt schemes. "You're saying my children died for civilization? That their lives were the necessary price for your comfort?" Garrett met her eyes without flinching. "I'm saying empires require sacrifice, usually from those least able to afford it. That's unfortunate but inevitable." The honesty was somehow worse than lies would have been. At least lies suggested shame, suggested some recognition that what he'd done was wrong. Garrett believed every word. Believed exploitation was just how the world worked. That strength justified dominance and weakness invited victimization. He wasn't a monster. Monsters knew they were doing evil. Garrett was something more dangerous, a man who'd convinced himself that cruelty was pragmatism and suffering was necessary. The kind of person empires produced when power went unchecked for generations. The verdict came on the 5th day. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was what Raelthorn had been dreading since this started. Execution. Not unanimous. 3 judges voted for exile, 2 for forced labor. But the majority wanted blood for blood. Wanted the man who'd destroyed so many lives to pay the ultimate price. Raelthorn sat in his chambers that night, staring at the execution order that required his signature. 1 stroke of a pen. 1 name written in ink. And Lord Garrett died. Simple, clean, justice according to the new laws they'd established. So why did his hand shake? Selene found him there hours later, still staring at unsigned parchment. You're thinking too hard, she said quietly. Probably. She sat beside him. Her presence was warm in the cold room, grounding. He deserves to die, she said. Not arguing, just stating fact. What he did. The lives he destroyed. The suffering he caused without remorse. Execution is mercy compared to what his victims endured. I know. Then sign it. Raelthorn's hand moved toward the quill. Stopped. If I do this, I'm saying the new empire is just the old one with better rhetoric. That we still solve problems by killing people. That mercy only applies when it's convenient. If you don't, you're saying justice is optional. That powerful people can commit atrocities and walk away as long as they cooperate afterward. Both were true. Both were unbearable. That was the thing about leadership that nobody talked about. The impossible choices where every option had a cost, and the price was always paid by someone who didn't deserve it. What would you do? Raelthorn asked. Selene was quiet for a long moment, then she took the quill from his hand. Set it down. I'd remember why we started this. Not to perpetuate cycles of violence, not to create a kinder tyranny, to build something fundamentally different. She met his eyes. Garrett's gonna die anyway. He's got maybe 5 years left based on what the healers say. Heart condition, deteriorating, so the question isn't whether he dies. It's whether we kill him or time does. That's not the same thing. No. But it changes the calculation. Selene's voice went soft. We can execute him and prove that justice means blood. Or we can sentence him to spend his remaining years in service, working in the districts he exploited, seeing the faces of people he destroyed, living with the reality of what he did instead of dying before consequences have time to sink in. That's crueler than execution. Maybe. Or maybe it's the kind of accountability that actually changes things, that forces people to confront their choices instead of escaping them through death. Raelthorn stared at the unsigned execution order, at the choice that would define what kind of empire they were building. Then he picked up the quill, wrote a single word across the parchment, commuted, added the sentence modification. Forced labor in the outer districts for the remainder of Garrett's natural life. Under supervision, without privilege or status. He signed it, set the quill down, and felt something uncurl in his chest, something that had been tight since the amphitheater, since the moment he'd chosen mercy over vengeance and spent weeks wondering if that made him weak. This was what strength actually looked like. Not domination, not the ability to kill without hesitation. The courage to choose differently even when violence was easier. Selene leaned against him. You're going to catch hell for this. Yeah. Half the council will call it weakness. The Omega judges will feel betrayed. Garrett's supporters will see it as vindication. Probably all true. And you're doing it anyway. Yeah. Raelthorn pulled her closer. Because if we execute him, we prove nothing changes. Power still comes from the ability to kill. Justice is still just revenge with legal paperwork. He stared at the signed commutation. But if we make him live with consequences, if we force him to see the humanity of people he treated as resources, then maybe one person learns something. Maybe the Empire learns that accountability doesn't require death. Or maybe you're just too soft to do what's necessary, Selene said. But there was no judgment in her voice, just observation. Maybe. Raelthorn smiled tiredly. Ask me in 5 years if Garrett's learned anything, or if I just gave evil a longer leash. I will. They sat together in the candlelight while the empire outside continued its slow transformation, while nobles adapted or fled or plotted resistance, while Omega councils gained authority and former servants learned to navigate power structures that had spent generations excluding them. It was messy, chaotic, the kind of fundamental restructuring that would take decades to stabilize. But it was happening, not through revolution's clean violence, through the harder work of changing systems one law at a time, one trial, one choice to break cycles instead of perpetuating them. The kind of change that didn't make good stories because it was too slow and complicated and full of compromise. But it was real. And it was lasting. And years from now, when historians looked back at this moment, they'd mark it as the point where the empire stopped being about domination and started being about something harder to define, but infinitely more valuable. Community. Accountability. The radical idea that power should serve people instead of the other way around. Deet. 6 months later, Selene stood in what used to be the throne room. The throne itself was gone, removed. In its place was a circular table large enough for 40 people, council members from across the empire, Omega representatives, noble houses that had adapted, scholars, craftspeople, farmers, every voice that mattered in the new order. She still wasn't comfortable here, still felt like an imposter among people born to power while she'd spent her life washing clothes and scraping by. But Raelthorn's hand found hers under the table, squeezed once. And she remembered she belonged here not because of birth or status, but because she'd earned it. Through surviving, through fighting, through refusing to stay invisible when the Empire demanded it. The Council was debating trade agreements with the Eastern Territories. Complicated stuff about tariffs and resource allocation. The kind of policy that made her eyes glaze over. But then one of the noble representatives suggested reverting to the old labor contracts. Just temporarily. Just to stabilize production while they transitioned to the new wage systems. And Selene felt her spine straighten, felt the words rising before she could stop them. No. The council turned to look at her. Those labor contracts were slavery with paperwork, she continued. Her voice was steady despite her hands shaking. We didn't fight a war to temporarily reinstate the same exploitation we were trying to end. But the transition is causing economic disruption, the noble argued. Production is down, costs are rising. We need stability. We need justice. Stability built on suffering isn't stability. It's a powder keg waiting to explode. The noble's face reddened. With respect, you lack the expertise to understand the economic complexities. I lack the expertise to ignore human cost in favor of profit margins. Selene cut him off. I understand perfectly well that your stability requires people like me to suffer quietly, so people like you can maintain comfort. The room went silent. Raelthorn said nothing, just watched her with something that looked like pride. The head of the Omega Council spoke next. Her voice carried weight earned through years of organizing in districts where survival was a daily battle. Council member Selene is correct. We've been down this road before. Temporary measures become permanent. Exceptions become standard practice. If we compromise on labor protections now, we signal that the reforms are negotiable whenever they're inconvenient. The debate continued, heated, passionate, voices raised in disagreement. But that was the point. That was what made it different from the old empire where the king decided and everyone else obeyed. Now they argued, challenged each other, forced competing interests to find common ground instead of one side dominating through authority. It was messy, inefficient, the kind of governance that took 3 times longer than dictatorial decree. But it was real. And it involved everyone instead of just the powerful. The vote went in favor of maintaining labor protections. Not unanimous, but majority rule counted for something in ways it never had before. Afterward, as the council dispersed, the noble who'd argued for reverting contracts approached Selene. You made me look foolish, he said stiffly. I made you accountable, she corrected. There's a difference. His jaw worked. Then, slowly, he nodded. Perhaps. I'll consider the perspective you raised. It wasn't an apology. Wasn't even agreement. But it was acknowledgement. And in an empire learning to function through dialogue instead of domination, acknowledgement was progress. Selene watched him leave, felt Raelthorn's presence beside her. That was brutal, he murmured. Yeah. And absolutely necessary. She turned to face him. This is exhausting. Every meeting, every debate, every time I open my mouth, I'm terrified I'll say something stupid and prove I don't belong here. You belong here more than most. Raelthorn's hand cupped her face. You understand what policies actually mean, how laws translate to lived experience. That's worth more than all the economic expertise in the empire. I'm still just a washerwoman pretending to be important. No. You're a woman who survived systems designed to kill you and came out the other side determined to make sure nobody else has to. His thumb brushed her cheek. That's not pretending. That's leadership. Selene wanted to believe him. Wanted to feel like she deserved this position and this authority and this man who looked at her like she'd hung the moon. But doubt was harder to kill than external enemies. Doubt lived inside. Whispered that she was a fraud. That eventually everyone would realize she didn't belong, and the whole thing would collapse. Raelthorn seemed to read her thoughts. Probably the mate bond. probably just knowing her too well after 6 months of rebuilding an empire together. "You're spiraling," he said gently. "I can feel it." "Yeah. Want to know what helps me when I spiral?" "What?" "Remembering that everyone here is making it up as they go." Raelthorn gestured at the empty council chamber. "We're building something that's never existed before. An empire where power comes from consent instead of domination, where accountability applies to everyone, where the people at the bottom have voice." He pulled her closer. "Nobody knows how to do that. We're all pretending until it becomes real. The only difference is you're honest about it, while most of them hide behind confidence that's just as fake as your doubt. That's actually helpful." "Yeah. I have moments," Selene smiled, kissed him softly. "Take me home," she said. "I need to remember we're not just council members and kings. We're people who get to exist outside these walls." Home was no longer the palace. Raelthorn had moved them to a residence in the Middle District, close enough to the council chambers to be accessible, far enough from the old power centers to make a statement. The king lived among his people now, not above them. It was a small house, modest by noble standards, but it had a garden where Lucian grew healing herbs, and a kitchen where Selene still sometimes cooked despite having servants who insisted it wasn't necessary. Because some habits were grounding. Some choices were about maintaining connection to who you'd been before power complicated everything. That night, lying in bed with Selene's head on his chest and moonlight filtering through windows, Raelthorn felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the absence of problems. The empire still had plenty of those. Noble houses still resisted reforms. Economic transitions created hardship. Territories on the border still threatened instability. But peace in the sense of knowing he was doing the right thing. That the choices he made aligned with principles instead of just pragmatism. That the woman beside him wasn't a political liability or a weakness to exploit, but a partner who made him better. "You're thinking too loud," Selene murmured. "I can feel your brain working from here." "Sorry." "What about?" "Everything. Nothing. How we got here. Whether it'll last. If our kids will grow up in the empire we're building, or if it'll collapse back into the old patterns." Selene propped herself up on one elbow. "Kids?" Raelthorn froze. Realized what he'd said. Maybe? Eventually? If you want?" His usual eloquence abandoned him completely. "We've never actually discussed, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. Raelthorn's brain short-circuited, tried to process, failed spectacularly. "You're, what?" "Pregnant. About 8 weeks based on what the healers say." Selene's expression was impossible to read. "I found out 3 days ago. Been trying to figure out how to tell you. And you just, dropped it into casual conversation? Seemed as good a time as any." Raelthorn stared at her, at the woman who'd become his mate and partner in the center of his world, who was now carrying his child. Their child. The future of the empire they were building. "How do you feel about it?" he managed. Terrified, excited, overwhelmed. Selene's hand moved to her still flat stomach. "I spent 6 years trying to keep Lucian alive, trying to survive day to day. And now I'm bringing a child into this mess we've created, into an empire that's still figuring out if it wants to exist." Her eyes met his, but also hopeful. "Because our child won't grow up in the empire I did. Won't have to hide or grovel or accept exploitation as inevitable. They'll grow up in whatever we build, whatever comes from this experiment in doing things differently." Raelthorn's hand covered hers on her stomach. His child. Growing inside the woman who'd changed everything. "Twins," he said suddenly. "What?" "The healers." "They said twins? How did you—" Selene's eyes widened. "The mate bond? Probably. Or I'm just making wild guesses. But I felt it. 2 heartbeats. Faint, but there." Selene laughed. It was shaky and overwhelmed and beautiful. "Of course it's twins. Because one wasn't complicated enough. They're going to be incredible," Raelthorn said softly. "Half you, half me. All the strength and compassion and stubborn determination that's kept us alive through everything. Or all the trauma and baggage and terrible decisions. That too. But we'll figure it out, same way we figured out everything else." together, making mistakes and learning and trying to be better than what came before. He kissed her, gentle, reverent. You're going to be an amazing mother, and you're going to be a disaster of a father who spoils them rotten. Probably. But they'll never doubt they're loved. They lay together in the darkness, hands intertwined over the life they'd created, over the future that was simultaneously terrifying and full of possibility. And somewhere in the outer districts, in the house Raelthorn had secured for him, Lucian studied medical texts and practiced healing techniques, learning to save lives in an empire that had spent his childhood telling him he didn't matter, becoming living proof that the old definitions of strength and value and worth were lies people told to maintain power. Mout. 2 years later, on the anniversary of the amphitheater confrontation, Raelthorn stood on the balcony overlooking the capital. The city looked different. Not just physically, though reconstruction had changed the landscape. Markets where there used to be guard stations. Schools where debt prisons had stood. Green spaces carved from what used to be noble estates. But the feel was different. The energy. People walked through streets without fear. Omegas conducted business in districts that had been closed to them before. Children played in squares where public executions used to draw crowds. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice didn't disappear overnight. Economic disparities still existed. Some noble houses still plotted resistance to reforms. But it was better, measurably, undeniably. The empire was healing. Behind him, inside the residence, Selene managed the chaos of twin toddlers who'd inherited their father's alpha dominance and their mother's complete lack of fear. Raelthorn heard crashes, laughter, Selene's patient voice explaining for the 100th time that shifting inside the house was not acceptable behavior. He smiled, turned back to the view. A figure appeared beside him. Lucian, now 17, taller, confident in ways he hadn't been when they'd met. The boy had become the Empire's youngest licensed healer, worked in the districts where medical care had been luxury instead of right, saved lives daily while proving that shifting ability had nothing to do with value. "They're destroying the kitchen again," Lucian said mildly. "Yeah, I heard. You're not helping?" Raelthorn grinned. "Strategic retreat. Let their mother handle discipline. I'm the one who sneaks them sweets when she's not looking. You're going to raise tiny tyrants. That's the plan." They stood in comfortable silence, uncle and king, brothers through choice instead of blood. "I got the final report from the border territories," Lucian said eventually. "The new healthcare clinics are operational. Mortality rates among Omegas dropped 40% in the last year. That's good. Better than good. It's proof this works. The changing systems actually saves lives instead of just making us feel better about ourselves." Raelthorn nodded. The long game. The kind of change that took years to measure, but fundamentally transformed how empires functioned. Not as dramatic as revolution, not as satisfying as executing enemies, just the slow accumulation of choices that prioritize people over profit. Boring, difficult, absolutely essential. "You ever regret it?" Lucian asked quietly. "Giving up absolute power, sharing authority, making everything slower and more complicated." "Every day," Raelthorn admitted. "Then I remember what absolute power created, what I was maintaining by refusing to see suffering. How many people died while I sat on that throne believing comfortable lies?" He looked at Lucian. "You want to know the real secret of leadership? It's not strength or strategy or even compassion. It's being willing to doubt yourself, to admit when you're wrong, to change course when evidence demands it. That's the opposite of what most leaders do." "Yeah. And look where most empires end up." Raelthorn gestured at the city. "This messiness we've created, this frustrating, inefficient system where everyone has voice, it's the closest thing to sustainable power I've ever seen. Because nobody can destroy it by killing one person. Nobody can seize control by force alone. Power is distributed, accountable, revocable, the kind of empire that might actually survive him." From inside, Selene's voice called, "Rael, your daughter just shifted and climbed the bookshelf. I need backup." Raelthorn laughed. "Duty calls." He started toward the door, paused. "Lucian, thanks. For everything. For saving us in the warehouse. For believing in this when nobody else did. for becoming living proof that the Empire's old values were poison. The boy's expression softened. You saved me first, gave me education and protection and the chance to become something more than defective. This is just paying it forward. No, this is you being extraordinary on your own terms. Raelthorn clapped his shoulder. Don't diminish that. Inside, chaos reigned. One twin in wolf form on top of the bookshelf, the other attempting to follow. Selene standing below, looking equal parts exasperated and amused. Raelthorn shifted. His massive wolf form moved with practiced care around furniture, plucked his daughter from the bookshelf with gentle jaws, set her down. She shifted back immediately, grinned up at him with his eyes and her mother's stubborn determination. Again, she demanded. No, again. Raelthorn shifted back, scooped her up. It's almost bedtime. Don't want bedtime. Yeah, well, neither do I, but your mother's scary when we don't cooperate. Selene raised an eyebrow. Scary? Really? Terrifying. Raelthorn kissed her. She kissed him back while their children made exaggerated gagging noises. This was life now. Not grand strategy or political maneuvering or war councils, just the daily work of raising children and managing an empire, and loving someone who'd shown him strength had nothing to do with domination. Later, after the twins finally fell asleep, after Lucian retreated to his studies, Raelthorn and Selene stood together on the balcony. The city spread out below them, quiet, peaceful, the kind of peace earned through choice instead of imposed through fear. We did it, Selene said softly. Not perfectly, but we actually changed things. We're still changing things. This is going to take generations. Good. Means our kids will have purpose, something to build on instead of just maintain. Raelthorn pulled her close. You ever miss it? The simplicity of washing clothes and surviving day to day? Before all this complicated responsibility? Sometimes. Then I remember what survival cost. The fear, the helplessness, the watching people I cared about suffer while I could do nothing. She turned to face him. This is better. The complication, the responsibility, the knowing that choices we make actually matter, that we can shape the future instead of just enduring it. Her hand found his. We earned this, Rael. Both of us. Through surviving and fighting and refusing to accept that suffering was inevitable, we earned the right to build something better. And if it all falls apart after we're gone, then at least we tried. At least we proved it was possible. Someone else can pick up the work and keep building. Raelthorn stared at the empire they'd transformed, at the city where Omegas walked without fear and children like Lucian had futures beyond survival, at the legacy they were creating not through conquest, but through the harder work of changing minds, one policy at a time. It wasn't the empire he'd envisioned when he'd taken the throne 8 years ago. Wasn't the clean authority and decisive leadership history celebrated. It was messier, slower, required constant negotiation and compromise, and the humility to admit when you were wrong, but it was real, and it was lasting. And years from now, when their children sat on councils making decisions about the empire's future, they'd remember that power came with responsibility, that strength meant protecting instead of dominating, that the people at the bottom weren't resources to exploit, but human beings whose voices mattered just as much as anyone else's. That was the legacy worth leaving, not monuments or military victories or territory conquered, but the radical idea that everyone deserved dignity, that systems could change, that empires didn't have to be built on suffering. I love you, Raelthorn said quietly, for giving me bread when I was starving, for showing me truth when I was blind, for being brave enough to stand beside me while we burned the old world down and built something better from the ashes. Selene smiled, that tired, beautiful smile that had started everything. I love you too, for seeing me as human instead of expendable, for choosing principle over convenience, for being the kind of leader worth following instead of just fearing. They stood together as moonlight painted the capital in silver, as the empire they'd rebuilt rested beneath stars that had witnessed countless rises and falls of power. And somewhere in the palace archives, historians recorded this period as the Reformation. The moment when the empire stopped being about domination and became about something harder to quantify but infinitely more valuable: justice, accountability. The messy, complicated work of making power serve people instead of the other way around. Future generations would study this transformation, would debate whether mercy had been wisdom or weakness, whether sharing authority had strengthened or endangered the empire. But the people who lived through it knew the truth, that real strength wasn't domination, real leadership wasn't control, real power was choosing to be better every day, even when it was harder, even when violence was easier, even when the old ways whispered that compassion was weakness. Because at the end of everything, what mattered wasn't how much territory you conquered or how many enemies you crushed. What mattered was whether the people you protected could sleep without fear, whether children grew up believing they mattered, whether the next generation inherited possibility instead of just survival. And beneath silver moonlight, in a city finally learning to breathe, the Iron Alpha held his mate and knew he'd made the right choice. Not because it was easy, not because it guaranteed success, but because some things were worth fighting for even when victory wasn't certain, like dignity, like justice, like the radical belief that every person deserved better than systems designed to crush them. The empire would endure, not through fear or domination or the strength of a single ruler, but through the collective choice of people who refused to accept suffering as inevitable, who demanded better, who built better, who became the change they'd spent generations waiting for someone else to create. That was the real revolution. Not violence, not bloodshed, not tearing down the powerful, but the moment when people decided they mattered, when the invisible refused to stay hidden, when the exploited stood up and said enough. And the empire would never be the same,